Hello, my fellow Westorians. I'm Aziz. With me is Ashea, and this is Valar Rereadis. A Dance with Dragons is the longest of the books so far. It's also the darkest and least understood because it's the most recent. It's the culmination, also so far, of George R. R. Martin's style, honed over the course of the prior books and the rest of his career. It has the extended length of A Storm of Swords, the expanded pacing of A Feast for Crows, brings POVs together like a Clash of Kings, and has the setup of a Game of Thrones. If you're watching live, you can feel free to ask live questions. You can also send questions and comments ahead of time. Join us on one of our social media outlets to become part of the discussion. That includes Facebook, Flick, Discord, and Slack. We got links in the description if you're watching the video, links in the description if you're listening to the podcast. Either way, you've got access. Check out the Isle of Faces podcast. That's Joe Buckley's show. He calls it Scraps and Scrolls when it's the tandem Valar Rereadis read. And check out Nina Friel on Tumblr. That's Good Queen Alley. .tumblr.com. Good Queen Alley with one L. And check out my San Rixian shirt here if you're watching on the video. Hope you got a good look at that. It's House Velaryon. Masters of Driftmark. Go to sanrixian.com for cool shirts like this. Lots of more available. She's got a lot built up by now. I wouldn't even be able to tell you how many, but it's a large number. We are back after 1 week off. We were not around for the New Year's edition of Valar Rereadis. Didn't happen. We took a week to work on some of our other projects with success. We are recording a scripted episode on Tuesday, so that should be out within a reasonable amount of time after that. This week for Valar Rereadis, we have 4 chapters as per usual. A Ghost in Winterfell is the first one, called Winter Falls on Winterfell, aka A Song of Snow and Murder.
Tyrion 10.
Tyrion X.
XX. Tyrion 10, the gang gets sold into slavery, aka in the belly of the yellow whale.
Jaime 1, the North of the South, aka A Tree of 1,000 Ravens and One.
And Jon 10, a red wedding with no deaths, aka How I Married Your Magnar.
Tyrion 10 and Jon 10, that's pretty cool. And they're back to back, the brothers together, but not really together. They're very far apart, not just in terms of physical distance, but they're still kind of mad at each other, aren't they? Today, Hoster Blackwood, a young student of history, opines on the repeating and bloody cycles of revenge and war that play out over the centuries. As a Blackwood, he's more familiar than most when it comes to long-running feuds. And when Jaime hears him say that countless marriages and attempts at peace have failed to bring Blackwoods and Brackens together, he tells Hoster Blackwood that perhaps the only solution is for one side to wipe out the other. A little too much like your dad there, Jaime. That is the view of a lot of different factions opposing each other today. Even though Tywin's gone, that attitude exists elsewhere. He's certainly not the only one to have that attitude. He's just one of the most severe and forceful about it. In some form or fashion, though, we see that almost everywhere. Enemies that have no chance at reconciliation, often because of extremely old grudges, maybe not as old as Bracken and Blackwood, but still very old. It's rather plain to point to this when talking about Slaver's Bay, right? I mean, we've talked about possible solutions for Meereen and the rest, and destroying it entirely might not be ideal, but it might be the only available option. It might be what happens under a similar mindset, too. Regardless of what we want to happen, it's definitely a possibility, a strong possibility. Surely there's no way the Freys will be forgiven in the North, right? Nor will Stannis and the Boltons find accord. Those aren't ancient enemies, but I don't see any peace between them. Jon is doing his best, but there are Northerners and other men on the wall who don't appear to be budging on the issue of any sort of alliance or friendship with the Free Folk. Some of them view it as a kill or be killed situation, and Jon's going to bear that brunt by the end of the book. Winter itself, as a representation of the others, wants to wipe out, well, everyone, I guess. Perhaps the best example of there being no chance at peace we can have. It's a bit less direct as some of these human conflicts, but a lot more certain. Speaking of wiping out your enemies, the legacy of the Red Wedding is rather prime today. Shows what happens if you don't quite wipe out all of them. The Freys are openly condemned at Winterfell for their role in it, and the capture of Great John during that helps explain the behavior of his uncles Crowfoot and Horsebane. Lords Bracken and Blackwood hate each other, obviously, but they both condemn the Red Wedding when speaking to Jaime, and they both lost men there, including Lord Blackwood's second son, Lucas. It's less direct for Tyrion, but even his marriage to Sansa was in part arranged because of Robb's death, which Lord Bracken calls murder even now, even as he's on Jaime's side, ostensibly. Likewise, Tywin's legacy is particularly felt in this one. I mean, the Red Wedding, of course, but not just that. Stannis went north in part because Tywin snuck up behind him after allying with the Tyrells. Tyrion thinks of Tywin a lot, specifically, not ruefully for once. He's not mad at his father for once. He actually thinks about some of the things his father taught him, in addition to thinking how horrified Tywin would be at seeing his son as a slave in a grotesquerie. That almost makes Tyrion laugh, though. Jaime thinks of his father quite a lot during his chapter as well, where the devastation of the Riverlands, as ordered by Lord Tywin, is felt. Of course, hey, my dad did this, is part of what he's thinking. He comes to break the siege at Riverrun, or at Raventree Hall, after having done Riverrun last book, by offering peace terms, and he sees that it's really bad there, too. There's no food, winter is coming, the outlook is grim. And we certainly have some siege and siege-like conditions today. In addition to Raventree Hall, we clearly had that there. We have Winterfell, besieged by snow and waiting for Stannis to perhaps show up and besiege them as well. But as we saw last time, Stannis is sort of besieged by snow himself, though nearby. Tyrion and company are sold in sight of the siege lines outside Meereen. Sieges are tough, and there's a moving theme here of finding strength amidst some of the most horrible situations. As everyone worries and stresses inside Winterfell, Theon pushes past a lot of his identity issues. He's like one of the few people going up while everyone else is going down mentally. I mean, I wouldn't call him strong, but he's on the upswing. Tyrion is as clever and focused as we've seen him in this book or ever, even as he's being sold into slavery. And he notably spends less time lamenting over what his family has done to him and his guilt, which recently had threatened to overwhelm him to the point that suicide was occasionally on his mind. Jaime as well starts to break free from some old habits. He actually takes note of another woman's attractiveness, unusual given how loyal to Cersei he is in that way. And that's, of course, not the only wedge between him and his sister right now. More immediately and relatedly to having feelings for women other than Cersei, he breaks his habit of extreme caution on campaign by leaving his army to go off with someone he trusts, Brienne, though, as we know, this is not a time that he should be trusting her. Jon and quite a few others get some respite, actually enjoying a wedding. I suppose this is less about finding strength and more about getting a break. Similar enough, though. But there's something to be said for marriages amidst war, ones that aren't overly forced. I mean, the marriage, I mean. The Magnar then dances in this one. I mean, that's unusual, right? The tension is definitely down a notch or two, though it's not gone by any means. This isn't like dreamland here. It's still, winter is still coming, snow is still all around them. There's still lots of problems. They're still trying to save humanity. But it is a light in the dark. It's a reminder of what is worth saving. It's a reminder that it's not just the people, it's the things that we do. Trying to save what makes us human. Love and laughter and fellowship and such. It's important to remind ourselves of what needs to be saved. Several different horns play a small role today. Wealthy Giscari often style their hair in the shape of horns. That's a different kind of horn than the horns that get blown, but still, Tyrion and company find themselves being sold to such. Sir Kenos of KC almost sounds the horn of Harrock at Raventree Hall, right before the drawbridge lowers. We're going to end the last chapter today with 2 blasts at the horn of the horn at Castle Black, appropriately announcing the arrival of Tormund, nicknamed, among other things, Hornblower, while a flint jokes about the horn of Joramun when a horn is heard outside Winterfell. Super chat from Maura Lee getting us started. Happy New Year. Happy Sunday. Looking forward to this. Love this series on history of Westeros. Shay is queen and Xerxes is fabulous as Paw of the King. Paw of the King. I can't believe I've never thought of that before. That's perfect. Paw of the King. And Xerxes is like right there. He's like a foot and a half off camera, perching up on his roost. He is looking very kingly right now. Okay, A Ghost in Winterfell. Winter falls on Winterfell, aka A Song of Snow and Murder. One of the best mystery chapters of the series. The closest thing we get to a whodunit, and it really is very much that. But there's so many other mysteries too. It's not just the whodunit. In addition to the murders, there's the voices at the tree, and Mance's interest in the crypts, not to mention what else he and the Spearwives are plotting. Who's blowing that horn? And who is the hooded man? And alongside the hidden identity of these murderers, Theon continues to struggle with his own identity, but makes major progress, while pretty much everyone else around him is headed in the opposite direction mental health-wise, because, being cooped up inside is something we can all relate to, but being cooped up inside with a murderer or murderers, that's a little different. The closest I've come to that personally is playing Among Us or Clue, or watching a movie like Clue, or Murder on the Orient Express, something like that. This chapter gives us several related things that we'll be seeing more and more of. Snow, winter, death, deteriorating mental health under such conditions, that kind of thing. I think we're going to see a lot more of it. There's less and less emotional energy available for politeness and just keeping up a decent face, not snapping at people. A lot of people at Winterfell hate each other in the first place, so they weren't exactly putting a lot of effort into keeping it civil in the first place. So the true feelings are coming out. It's harder to hide, put those masks on when you're rubbed raw and stressed out. It's a recipe for things to start getting ugly, or rather uglier. But the Freys and Manderleys and others aren't fighting each other yet. Not quite yet. Soon. Someone wants them to, however.
The dead man was found at the base of the inner wall, with his neck broken and only his left leg showing above the snow that had buried him during the night.
Theon, interestingly, is one of the few people whose mental health is on the upswing. Again, it's because the bar is so low that simply getting through a day without severe pain and guilt and fear is an improvement for him. This chapter has a lot of build-up towards him regaining some of that identity. That'll culminate in his final chapter, this book, where the title is actually Theon, the only one in this book that has his name in the title. So it's signifying the completion of that mini arc, I suppose. Not unlike Stannis' campaign, there's a lot of mirroring with what's going on here, even though these guys are stationary. They have their own kind of cold count going on, but they know the murders, the deaths rather, are from a murderer or murderers, rather than being able to blame it on the elements. So there isn't this sense of, while they're arguing with each other in Stannis' army, they're not worried about them killing each other. It's a hugely different problem. And of course, it's not the only parallel. There is going to be more fracturing than we've seen. I said there's not infighting, but we're going to get close to infighting, right? With the burnings. That's, a different version of morale breakdown and the worst things happening because the campaign is struggling. A good portion of this chapter is devoted to who is doing the killings at Winterfell, trying to figure all that out. Theon thinking through, suspecting different people. Of course, Theon himself is hauled before the lords as a possible candidate for being the murderer, and they argue about it, and we see some of the anger aimed at each other as they're sitting there talking to Theon and accusing him. They just can't control themselves because of how much animosity is between them. After all, even Lady Dustin calls out Aenys Frey, basically saying he's a fool for not realizing that, hey, do you guys not realize that everyone here hates you? Are you really not aware of that? Joe writes that this is a little bit of a indulgence for Barbary. She's smart, and she knows that their alliance depends on people not turning on the Freys. So, yet she's turning on them and telling them that other people are turning on them or about to. So she's sort of not pragmatic with comments like that, but it also just goes to show she can't help herself. She really did lose people at the Red Wedding, even the Riswells. The Riswells even speak up about the Red Wedding. Like, we lost men at the Red Wedding too. They don't curse at Aenys, but even they bring it up. And the reason that's significant is the Riswells are the most locked in to being Bolton allies, other than Bolton himself. There's really no one closer. They're tied by marriage. There's a Roose Riswell. It goes to show just how close that family alliance is. So if the Riswells are turning a little bit, that's a problem for Roose, a big problem. And it tells him that it might not just be them. If his closest allies are starting to have issues, then what does that say about, say, Manderley? Which is where it goes next, right? None of them really suspect a third party. They don't suspect Mance. They don't suspect what it probably is, Mance and the Spearwives. They're thinking, oh, Stannis has some agent inside, or it's Manderley, or it's this Theon. Now, they move on from Theon pretty quickly. Rightly so, I suppose. He doesn't really seem like a good candidate. At the end of the chapter does make it almost certain that it's Abel Mance and the Washerwomen, but if that's the case, and I do think it is, recall that it's not going to be them who kill Little Walder next chapter, and it's his death amongst a couple other things that really forces the issue. It's not just that, but that's a big deal as far as finally having men sent away to go find Stannis. The other major thing is they actually get an idea of where Stannis is, which, of course, they can't go attack him unless they know where he is. So a lot of these things come together. But remember that Walder's going to blame it on Manderley men. And I think that he's doing that because he senses the tension. And he's like, well, everyone is blaming Manderley for stuff, so why don't I pin this murder on Manderley too? They're going to believe it. It's an easy scapegoat. And it pretty much works. Joe and Nina agree. It's almost certainly the Spearwives doing the killing. Mance is not doing any of the killing himself. He's maybe directing it. Maybe he might be telling them who to kill. He might not be. Maybe they're just coordinating on it, something like that. But it seems pretty likely that their plan is to create chaos between these two factions. If they can get the phrase fighting the Manderleys inside the castle walls, escaping with Arya, well, it won't be necessarily easy, but it'll be a lot easier if they're literally fighting each other. It's really interesting thinking back to when this chapter was new and thinking about where it's at now in terms of the way the average member of the fandom views it, or maybe the summary view of this chapter. People used to really wonder about this hooded man, and I was one of them. There's all sorts of theories about what he was doing, but now I'm at the point where I don't think this hooded man is anybody. I strongly believe he's probably no one, and I don't mean like a faceless man, because he's just part of the pastiche of Theon wondering who the killer is. And there's really no detail about this character that points him being someone specific. Some people think he might be Harwin. I don't see how he could be Harwin. Harwin is still with the Brotherhood Without Banners. Hal Mullen was one theory I entertained for a while. We haven't heard that name in a while. That's Captain Obvious. Because he's still alive, probably. He might be in the neck or something. We haven't seen him forever. He was in charge of the bones to bring Ned's bones home. And, well, the bones never emerged from the neck, as Lady Dustin says. So one possibility is that brought up by Laura Brondos in our Facebook group is that there's a lot of people who would want to check on this Arya. Not to see if she's okay, but to see if she's really Arya, because there's a lot of suspicion that she's not. And so they'd need to send someone that would be able to identify her. So that would argue for a former resident of Winterfell, like maybe Hal Mullen, because they need someone who knows what Arya looks like, and there's only so many people that could do that. So it still is a mystery, even though I lean towards it being nobody in particular. Because even if we do have this idea of someone checking in on Arya, it doesn't have to be this guy, right? It could be any number of other people. So we'll leave that one on the shelf. It's possible the Hooded Man is somebody important, but I've gone through 10 years of thinking about it, and this is where I'm currently at. One other theory that was out around the time actually does put the blame on Theon. It's the Theon Durden theory, that's a reference to the movie Fight Club, or the book Fight Club, either one. And the idea was that Theon is becoming someone like he has a split personality, just like in Fight Club, where he doesn't know what he's doing, and while he's in his other personality, he's killing people. I really don't think so for this, though. It was a clever idea, but there's just no real evidence of it. He's not like he finds blood on his hands. Like, how did that get there? There's not even the tiniest clue for that. But I thought it was fun to relay to y'all because it's a neat story, neat theory. from back in the day. So we've talked a lot about all the ways the books give us hints as to what winter will be like, right? And these northern chapters lately are startling because we read passages like this one Ashay is about to read, and we think, wait, it's going to be worse than this? Whoa.
Endless, ceaseless, merciless, the snow had fallen day and night. Drifts climbed the walls and filled the crenels along the battlements. White blankets covered every roof. Tents sagged beneath the weight. Ropes were strung from hall to help men keep from getting lost as they crossed the yards. Sentries crowded into the guard turrets to warm half-frozen hands over glowing braziers, leaving the wall walks to the snowy sentinels the squires had thrown up, who grew larger and larger every night as wind and weather worked their will upon them.
Yeah, so that's intense, right? I mean, you can't even go from one building to another without a rope guide. Like, they have ropes strung up. Picture Winterfell on TV. Imagine going from one side of the yard to the other and not being able to see where you're going. It's that intense, the snow. So, wow, right? It's incredible. Nina writes, the snow is the conspirator to the murders, if not the cause. In some cases, it is the cause in some cases, right? Because it hides the bodies, it hides the blood, it hides the evidence, and it also hides the explanation. Like, they posit that this one Riswell man fell off the wall walk, even though it doesn't really make sense, because why did he climb the wall walk to pee? Like, why not just go in the yard? It just doesn't make sense, yet they still just, like, no one wants to think about it. No one wants to face the truth that it was almost certainly a murder. And, of course, the murders get more and more blatant, and they can't be explained away. And then, of course, then it comes to a head. And this is part of why they start arguing about going and fighting Stannis. Like, why are we staying here? Let's go out and fight Stannis. Let's get it over with. And, of course, Lord Locke is like, dude, we don't know where Stannis is. We know he's out there somewhere, but do you see that snow? How are we going to find him? Are you insane? We have to at least know what general direction to march if we have any hope of finding him. And why would you want to go out in that? You know, there's all these different reasons. So, and that's funny because it doesn't sound like Hostein's going to listen, because he's going to charge blindly into the snow if the Ice Lake theory is correct, which I believe it is. And, of course, Aenys himself is going to die off page by riding out to do some scouting. He's going to fall into a pit trap. So, yeah. Nina writes she's inclined to side with Lord Locke here to some extent. The snow is actually helping Stannis' men in some way, not just keeping them from marching on them, but it gives them a common enemy to struggle against. The snow is awful. It's terrible. It's dealing severe damage to them, but they're not fighting each other, which is what's happening in Winterfell. One side is facing hardships, but they're way more determined. The others, they have higher morale. So it's like Stannis' side is in better shape with their disposition, way worse shape with their logistics, but they have better morale. They're more determined. They trust their leadership more, even as their situation is worse. And they're also on the offensive, which gives them the advantage of the edge of being able to act first. The defenders are waiting, not knowing when it's going to happen. Remember how we've talked about that a lot in a lot of different scenarios. It's not the knowing you're going to die. It's the not knowing when. And in this case, it's not death, but battle or maybe death, right? So it's really interesting comparing these two armies. So many advantages are on Roos's side, but none of the human advantages are on his side, unless you count numbers. I'm talking about, like, their morale, the trust in their leadership, the way that it's fear versus, like, these men want to follow Stannis, whereas the ones following the Boltons are afraid. And Joe notes that even the way Lord Locke is talking, it's almost a little treasonous. He's almost saying, he's talking about the way the old gods are acting in the storm, and it's almost a hint that they're punishing the Boltons, that they're the ones who are getting the ire of the old gods for, well, there's a lot of reasons why that might be the case. And it doesn't look good when you have a man saying, oh, maybe they're warmer than we think out there. And then Ramsay and his men go murder this guy in front of everybody. That, of course, it doesn't. That's terrible for morale. It's that old saying that Tyrion gave us way back. When you tear out a man's tongue, you're not, you're saying you're afraid of what he has to say. And that's basically what happens here. They killed that guy because they don't want talk like that messing with their morale. Rather than facing the issue of this morale, they're just trying to shut the talk up. But that doesn't really do the job, does it? And, well, that really gives us a lot of interesting... it's really interesting to consider where we're at with this conflict. We got the Stannis campaign, we got the Bolton campaign, and our POVs are Greyjoys for both of them. our insight into both of these sides of the campaign is Greyjoy. I think that's really neat. By the way, I have a Jaken on my lap now. He has found a spot. The note about the horses suffering in the blizzard is pretty important. It's very symbolic. After all, it was the stables were destroyed by Ramsay when he was sacking Winterfell way back at the end of A Clash of Kings. And so it's a bit fitting that the rebuilt stables collapsed on the Boltons. It's kind of karmic, although the horses really are the ones that suffered the most. Still, this has kind of come back on them. Like Winterfell has rejected them, and they had to bring the horses inside, which is just gross. And it makes everyone more uncomfortable because now they're eating and existing amidst a whole bunch of horses who are, doing their business wherever, because the horses, that's how they, that's what they do. In addition to the one guy who is said to have jumped, but who was probably pushed, and another guy who was thrown, we are building up to Theon and Jane being the third jumpers of a kind, and I guess Theon sees that, well, I guess you don't automatically die when you jump, so he gets the sense that it's possible to survive that jump, because the first guy breaks back, but the second guy is seen limping off into the snow before, well, the snow covers him. Now let's talk about the horn blasts and the drums that are being played outside. It's another great way to screw with the morale of those inside. They hear the horns and the drums and they think, oh, Stannis is here. They're wrong. Stannis is not there. That's Mor's Umber, a.k.a. Crow Food. A couple things about him real quick. He's at least 64 years old, might be 70. He's huge. He's one-eyed. He has a dragon glass eye in place of the missing one. That is cool, right? His own daughter was kidnapped by raiders, which means he really hates free folk, which may or may not become relevant later. With all this, free folk alliance and all that. He's the one that had some dude digging holes out front, and he's the one blowing those horns. And way back, here's a little theory, something to chew on. Way back in the Clash of Kings, don't forget, the Umbers showed up for the Harvest Feast, and so did the Manderleys, and they talked about having to work with the Manderleys. Like, Roderick and Lewin were like, you guys need to work together. You Manderleys, you Umbers, you got the trees, they got the shipbuilders, make some ships together. Those ships have been built. We saw that happening. Davos sees it, and Wyman tells him about it. So that implies this partnership did happen, and it did seem to be happening at the end of A Clash of Kings. So are the Umbers in league with the Manderleys here? Is Manderley on the inside doing his thing while Mor's Umbers on the outside, somewhat aware that Manderley's doing stuff on the inside? Are they together? It's entirely possible. After all, Manderley is drawing a lot of attention to himself. He's out there going, taunting the phrase, not really making a secret of things. And to me, that's almost like he's trying to draw attention away from everybody else because he knows he's going to get himself killed. He may as well get the most value possible out of that. Roose Wisrell says the same thing, right? To fight Lord Stannis, we would need to find him, similar to Lord Locke. Our scouts go out the Hunter's Gate, but of late, none of them return. That's why none of them are returning, because Mor's Umber's out there and taking them out. So pair that with the murders inside. You've got murders happening outside and inside. And that's where this notion that Stannis has agents within comes from. And they're like, okay. They get suspicious, and everyone's worried about their neighbor, and it really, really builds. Plus, they're worried about Melisandre. They're not just thinking about Stannis. They're like, he's got this red priestess. What's she capable of? They have no idea, but their imaginations are running wild because that's all they've got time to do. They're sitting there, they're waiting, they're thinking. It's not terribly healthy. And they're supposed to be all in this together, right? They're supposed to be suffering together to face this common enemy. But George is careful to show how there's little bits of friction even on that level where the common men aren't eating very well. They're getting the worst food. And, well, meanwhile, in Stannis' camp, he's not sitting there eating fancy, right? They kind of are all in it together over there. Even though they're arguing, no one's, being greedy. No one's keeping it all for themselves. They're still, they're that attitude of facing the problems as a group is more prevalent in Stannis' campaign. So it's not just a breakdown along fear and danger, but there's class issues forming as well. Think about what happened at Craster's. All those men were kept in line. They were bad dudes, evil guys. Maybe not evil is a little too strong a word, but criminals who are extremely greedy and murderous that the Night's Watch vows sort of kept them in line, but it was their brothers that kept them in line more so than anyone else. And when things got really bad at Craster's Keep, all that fell apart. They were no longer afraid of the things keeping them in line because they were starving and afraid. And that's what's happening here. One of the main things keeping people in line is fear of Roose Bolton, right? But if they're more afraid of starving, or if they're just so angry because they are starving, then all of a sudden the fear of Roose Bolton, it falls away. It's not nearly as threatening as it used to be. They're like, yeah, Roose is scary, but starving to death is scary too, and that's already happening. They'll take their chances in a group trying to overthrow a bad ruler if they're starving. So that's really bad for Roose because he needs fear to be able to control people. If he loses that, what does he have left? And that is why we see him start to slip a little bit. It's a great example of the value of rereading because Wyman Manderley, I think when you see Wyman taunting the phrase, when you read it the first time, personally, I had the sense of, oh, he's taunting them, but he's not really admitting it. I didn't get that the insult was rather brazen. In other words, I thought it was kind of an in-joke for the reader to get that Wyman is insulting them, whereas they're not fully grasping it. But on second and third and fourth and fifth, all these rereads I've had over the years, it became clear, no, they know what Wyman's saying. They get the implication quite clearly. He's telling them to their faces, I killed your kin, without quite saying it. He's like 99% saying, he's got that 1% deniability left. And well, that causes more consternation, more arguing, more fighting, and we get this quote.
It fell to Roger Riswell and Barbary Dustin to calm them with quiet words. Roose Bolton said nothing at all, but Theon Greyjoy saw a look in his pale eyes that he had never seen before, an uneasiness, even a hint of fear.
So it takes a lot to scare Roose Bolton, right? We were just hearing from Lady Dustin how he doesn't feel fear at all. Well, clearly he fears a little bit. She was exaggerating a little, but we're bordering on whatever it takes to scare him is there. So that says a lot. It's funny that they're like, hey, Singer, lighten the atmosphere for us. When Mance is the one who's coordinating all the murders in the first place, most likely. So, hey, dude who's the reason we're all upset, you be in charge of calming us down. That's kind of like Alanis Morissette ironic, isn't it? It's not actually ironic, but it's the kind of ironic that even I misuse the word in that way all the time. So, yep, hiring the murderer to bring peace to the people traumatized by the murderers. Isn't it ironic? So, there's a moment where Theon, let's talk about Theon's breakthroughs. He goes to the Godswood, to the Heart Tree, and before that, he's being accused of the murders. And Roose says, you were a hostage here. And he says, yes, my lord, a hostage. In his mind, though, he thinks it was my home, though. Not a true home, but the best I ever knew. Joe wrote in all caps, that's a gigantic stride forward for Theon. Like a few chapters ago already, he wasn't thinking of it as his home. Now he is. So that's straightforward character development, right? it's very meaningful. I feel it, how important that is for him. You can have it's hard to not have mixed feelings about Theon, but this is good. It's positive because this is going to be good for other people. When people who have power over others, when they grow less hateful, everyone wins, even if it's only a little. So here's him actually at the heart tree. Here's the first quote.
Will you read that?
The night was windless, the snow drifting straight down out of a cold black sky. Yet the leaves of the heart tree were rustling his name. Theon, they seemed to whisper. Theon. So the telltale word rustling is there again. That's always the clue. We've talked about this before. George doesn't really vary that. It's a distinct indication that the heart tree is speaking. And that's it's a pattern we identify in our heart tree series in Religions and Magic. Way back when we did that. This is going to happen again in Theon's Winds of Winter chapter, though it will be a raven saying Theon, Theon instead of the tree. But in both cases, it's almost certainly Bran. The question, like so many mysteries in this chapter, is why, though? Why is Bran talking to Theon? It's not like he seems to be passing a specific message on. He just says, Theon. And then a minute later, he hears Bran. So it's just like, George is telling us that this is Bran. He sees his face a minute later. But why, right? It is at least telling from the identity side of things because he's the only person calling him Theon. Everyone else is calling him Theon Theon Turncloak or just Turncloak or Reek. It's almost as if Bran is the only person not disrespecting Theon at every turn, even though Bran's the only one of this group of people who is actually victimized by Theon. The one person that has the best reason of all to be disgusted at Theon. Yet he's not acting like everybody else. He's not spitting at Theon's name, at least not as far as we can tell. You can't spit through a heart tree, can you? Here's more from the prayer. Here's the more important batch of paragraphs here.
A leaf drifted down from above, brushed his brow, and landed in the pool. It floated on the water, red, 5-fingered, like a bloody hand. Bran, the tree murmured. They know. The gods know. They saw what I did. And for one strange moment, it seemed as if it were Bran's face, carved into the pale trunk of the weirwood, staring down at him with eyes red and wise and sad. Bran's ghost, he thought. But that was madness. Why should Bran want to haunt him? He had been fond of the boy, had never done him any harm.
Okay, wait, what? Never done him any harm? Okay, Theon, I was with you for a minute there. So you're still lying to yourself some. We're making progress, but we're still lying to ourselves. He admits, in addition to this, he admits all the people he killed. He seems to somewhat come to terms with that. He names them specifically, which is important. The ones he scapegoated in particular are important. Remember, he kills Bran and Rickon, the Miller's boys, and then kills all the people that were witness to the fact that it wasn't Bran and Rickon. Farlan, 3 of his own men, Agar, Jaime Rednose, and Gelmar the Grim. Of course, that was basically Ramsay's idea, but Theon went along with it, so he certainly bears responsibility. And when Bran's presence was in this tree the first time, there was sadness. Theon sensed that sadness. There was crying, as if the tree was crying. We even named the chapter after that. Of course, that was during the wedding, and that's, or just after the wedding. You can kind of see maybe why Bran was sad about that or sad about other things. But again, this time, it's not so specific. It's almost as if Bran is just trying to contact Theon, just trying to get him to recognize that he's there. Just hello, almost. It's like it's not a specific message he's trying to pass on. Because if there is a specific message he's trying to pass on, I cannot perceive it. And I didn't get much from y'all either in terms of theories on that. So it feels like we kind of all agree on that this is a strong mystery. What is going on here? Why is Bran trying to talk to Theon? What's the point of this? One little theory I have, it doesn't get us all the way, but it helps maybe explain it, is we're told in Bran 3 that he's using his powers to seek home. Again, he's trying to remember what he had. He's trying to seek his father. He's trying to go to Winterfell. Maybe it's just as simple as that. He's hanging out at Winterfell in the Heart Tree, and well, there's Theon. He recognizes him, so hi, Theon. If there was other people at the Heart Tree, maybe he would say hi to them. But it might just be a little bit of that, a little bit of proximity. So some people were wondering how the washerwomen, the spearwives, knew about Theon in the heads and taking the heads, or else they would laugh at him. Well, I think that's actually pretty straightforward. They were listening. He was saying all this out loud as he was praying, and they clearly came up on him and were like, hey, who are you talking to? So all we have to do is imagine that they were listening for a few minutes before they said something. So that's pretty straightforward, I think. If there's another way they know, well, I'd like to know, because I don't know what that would be. I don't know how else they could know about any of that. So why do they want to go to the crypts? It's got this very Bael the Bard feel to it, right? After all, Mance is calling himself Abel, which is an anagram for Bael, the same 4 letters in a different order. And the whole story of Bael the Bard is that they hide in the crypts, which is what Bran and company did way back. So it's almost like they're trying to do that again, hide there during the fallout, maybe hide there with Arya while the two sides kill each other. Maybe they think there's a way out down there. We know there probably isn't, but they don't know that themselves. So that's just really cool, but it doesn't fully explain what's going on with them, but it does give us very strong clues, because there aren't a lot of options. They want to get out of there, and they clearly want to bring fake Arya with them because, well, they do that in the next chapter. Aegon the Sixth says, Hooded Manderly, a consideration for the next child for our game streams. That's a really good idea. We are playing every Friday we do a Crusader Kings game stream, which is has been modded, so it's very much in the world of A Song of Ice and Fire. And we're playing House Manderly. And let me tell you, the puns have been off the chain with playing House Manderly. We've got He Manderly, we got Spider Manderly, we got Mando Manderly, we got I'm a Manderly. It's
super macho.
It's endless. The chat just goes off with suggestions, and here's a really good one too. Hooded Manderly. That's awesome. Tree Girl and Nina both noticed something here, a little bit of symbolism, that while Wyman Manderly was taking all sorts of bites out of Frey's with the Frey pies, even Winter took a bite out of Hostine Frey when he lost an ear. You're like, well, how's that a bite? Because it's frostbite. Ayo! That's what cost him an ear. That's pretty cool. Sophia from Flick says, arguably, they are trapped inside the castle, not safely. There's only one gate that they can open. Even the main gate is iced shut. Only the Hunter's Gate functions properly, and they've got those drum beat sounds that are really similar to the Red Wedding. It's like they're trapped inside by what they've done. They violated guest right. They violated kinslayed. They did all this stuff. The old gods are mad, and they're trapped inside Winterfell. Winterfell is trapping them, not saving them, not protecting them. Great way to put it. I like that a lot. Beautiful symbolism way to interpret it. Tree Girl also suggests it's a little bit like the Mines of Moria, which is George R. R. Martin, monstrous fan of Lord of the Rings, so I definitely agree there's a strong possibility here. Mines of Moria has drums, and it's the same situation where there's a bunch of people trapped in a spot where it doesn't seem to where there's any way to get out. Also, Sophia suggests calling this one CSI Winterfell. That's a good one. I like that. Stefan B says this is a lot like Agatha Christie murders, which is something else that George is surely familiar with. She was a very famous mystery writer. People still buy her books. They're still adapted and things like that. But something she wrote about somewhat regularly was a murder mystery that had a closed-off location with lots of people that have motives to be the killer. And that's absolutely what we have here. Oberon19 and Stefan B also teamed up for a great take here that I missed that's really good. The notion of snow coming over the walls is very much foreshadowing whites coming over the walls because the same language was used by Jojen Reed when he dreamt of the sea flooding over the walls in advance of Theon's taking of Winterfell. So now we have that same language, but it's snow coming over instead. Great catch, y'all. I totally agree. It certainly fits with what we expect from the future. But let's move on. Tyrion 10. The gang gets sold into slavery, aka in the belly of the yellow whale. It's supposed to be Jonah and the whale, but instead we have Jorah. Meh. The tale of Jonah, not the whale's tale, includes the city of Nineveh, a sinful city. Meereen surely qualifies as such. I mean, it's what's happening outside the walls at the mouth of the Skahazadam that's the problem most of all, though, because that's where the slavery is. What's more sinful than that? Selling of people. And we have become accustomed to it in Slavers Bay somewhat. I mean, a huge portion of the slave trade in this area is luxury, right? These are seeing people as luxury goods is somehow even harder for some of us to understand or to wrap our heads around. There's kind of a misleading tendency for when we picture slavery. We mostly picture, at least I do, maybe I shouldn't be speaking for y'all, but toiling in mines or on fields. Like that's the most basic, as an American, that's what I think about from slavery in the U.S. was a lot of it was plantation slaves. But that's not nearly all. It's not just all manual labor. This isn't a real situation, of course, but it's not out of line with some of the worst examples of real-world slavery throughout human history, where it is a thing about pleasure and luxury goods and not for labor, which isn't, I'm not saying one's better than the other. It's all slavery. It's all horrible. But, for completeness' sake, for understanding what's happening, the clearest example of that we've seen to date on a regular basis is the bed slave, which is disturbing, but expected, right? It's not like, oh my goodness, I can't believe they thought of that. This chapter gives us new forms of horror that we may never have thought of before. People who are so rich that they buy people just to watch them die in creative ways or to breed them, to resell them. I mean, right off the bat, we've all heard the phrase treating people like objects, but it's never quite so close to being as literally true as it is here. As we've noted before, it can be misleading if you look at numbers without context. The reason Tyrion has so much screen time in this book is he's an observer of so many things he has very little control over. Dany has less total screen time, by quite a bit, really, but she drives the action almost entirely when she's around. Tyrion is an observer a lot more often. Tyrion was our window for a lot of Volantis. Quentin gave us some of that, too. With that came setting up a lot of the R'hllor situation, Jon Connington, young Aegon. Tyrion, of course, did have a big hand in that arc by arguing for them to go west first. But other than that, he was mostly having conversations and learning and not actually changing things, just giving information to the reader. Like before that, he was riding in a litter with Illyrio, just, drinking constantly. And that was really fun because we learned so much, but he wasn't driving the action. There's a lot of different characters that could have been in that role, getting the same info from Illyrio. So this is perhaps never more true than here when he's literally a slave. Slaves driving the action? I mean, when does that happen? Especially more than queens, like Daenerys. But Tyrion, it's a real reversal here. It's a real subjugation of expectations, because this is ostensibly the point at which he should have the least agency, but he actually manages to manipulate events quite a lot. He actually moves things and gets people to change their mind and impacts how they think when he's in chains. And that's a really interesting contrast to the state of mind he was in when the book began. He was miserable and aimless when with Illyrio and his slaves, who aren't called slaves, but we know what they are. But now that he's one of those too, it's totally different. Here's the first line.
Lot 97. The auctioneer snapped his whip.
Let's not bypass that those two now being named Lot 97 is obviously meant to remind us that Melisandre was also once a Lot. She was Lot 7, which is where we get confirmation that she was a slave, although we don't know exactly where she was sold. Still, that's a huge number too, 97. I mean, that means 96 lots were before those two. They were sitting there waiting in that humidity. What an awful scenario. We know being the subject of ridicule and laughter is Tyrion's worst nightmare, right? He hates that. It was imbued in him by his father, who contributed to it. He didn't laugh at him, but he certainly mocked him and was constantly disapproving. So now he is that. He's being treated as an object. He is specifically something to ridicule. That's what he's being sold as. That's his price. He is being sold as something ridiculous. So he doesn't have time to despair or to feel the sting to his pride. He has to be focused if he's ever going to escape. He comes alive here. And it's not entirely about him. He also feels responsible for Penny and a little bit for Jorah, though he doesn't actually have responsibility for Jorah. He still decides to save his life. It's really interesting how little fear and despair Tyrion feels here. He's very active, very alive, very focused. It's super interesting, I think. It's like he's at his best when he's got the least amount of room to maneuver. Maybe it's a statement about wealth a little bit. Maybe George is saying, look, when Tyrion's got everything he needs in life, he's kind of a waste. He's just chilling and not doing anything interesting. But when he's got to fight and struggle, that's when he's really interesting and at his most intelligent and clever. So one of these things that Tyrion has going for him, well, his two companions, this is not exactly their skill set. Penny was showing Tyrion a lot on the boat. She taught him a lot about how to survive and how to exist as someone of their stature. But right now, it's his turn. They don't have this skill set of understanding powerful people. He's got the kind of pride. He's been around ultra-rich people his whole life. He's got some insight into the type of person they are. He knows ultra-rich people. And that's a core message of Slaver's Bay in general. Wherever you go around the world, wherever there's power, kingdoms, empires, the Game of Thrones is being played, evil is being done, things like that. Tyrion brings a unique perspective here because we've seen these characters before. We've seen a lot of these very specific slave owners, in fact. But he is way more practiced in understanding who they are. Daenerys is not. She's young and doesn't have this kind of life experience yet. She's learning it, but Tyrion's already there. This is something that is rather clear as to something that she could use a lot of help with, and that he, more so than anyone, could be the one to provide it. We haven't actually returned to Meereen since Dany's wedding, but this chapter underlines how quickly that marriage is changing things, right? This slaving happening here is as a result of that peace deal. Remember, the deal was, okay, we're going to go back to slaving, except in Meereen. And Dany's going to, in her next chapter, complain. She's going to be like, those jerks, they're slaving where I can see it. The letter of the law is being upheld because technically it's not in Meereen, but she's like, I can see them. They're right there slaving. And it really pisses her off because, none of these negotiations were not in good faith. They're using every opportunity they can to break the deal without actually breaking the deal. And Dany's realizing that she should have maybe seen more of that coming, which is exactly the kind of thing Tyrion would, again, help her with. And another one of Dany's mistakes is perhaps shown here. Something else that maybe could have helped her had she taken more of their money. You see how awful these people are. They're so wealthy that they're still just blowing cash on real things that no one needs. I mean, again, these are luxuries. They're buying these slaves for fun, for pleasure, not for... I mean, it's not like buying them for labor. Again, it's not much better. But it's truly just all about pleasure and gratification. And of course, that's going to bother the hell out of Dany. And if we look farther ahead, well, this is part of how we're going to be able to justify, as readers and within Dany's mind, destroying all this, because that might be how it all goes. And seeing all these awful people and this, just how could this ever be fixed? You can't negotiate with this. You can't reform this. If that's the conclusion we come to, and I'm kind of there, if not all the way there, then what else can you do besides destroy it? It's kind of rotten to come to that conclusion, but call a spade a spade. If that's the only conclusion, then that's the only conclusion. So it's not just goods, it's not just luxury goods that these people are being sold as. It's like they're perishable goods. Like, they can do whatever they want with you. The auctioneer right here, it's a little bit under the radar, but he says, you can do this, you can do that, you can have them joust, you can do that, you can have them in a folly. Well, it's another small case of George gives us the answer before giving us the riddle. We don't know what a folly is yet. We don't find out what a folly is for another few chapters when Hizdar is going to explain to Dany what a folly is. But a folly includes the death of the participants while everyone laughs. So the auctioneer's like, hey, buy these two dwarfs and have them killed in front of people. That's what he's saying. And he pays 5,000 silver for it, for this, the right to just have them murdered eventually. Talk about extravagance, right? I mean, also, among other things, it's gross and murderous, but they just have all this extra money. So Brown Ben Plum shows up, and he gets into the bidding, and this is where it gets a little ironic. I don't know. Again, this might be misuse of the word ironic. I'm a little more aware of that today. But Brown Ben goes, and he starts bidding, and the bidding gets above his comfort zone. He's like, okay, never mind. Then he loses way more than that auction price gambling on Cyvasse, playing Tyrion. And this may seem a bit over the top, but I have some personal life experience here. Remember, I was a pro gambler myself for 10 years. And this is very much in line with how people with lots of money and big egos behave. It's a term called chasing losses. Actually, you don't even have a big ego and a lot of money to do this. Everyone does this to some extent. It's a mindset that comes when you're down, you've lost money, and you're trying to get even. And people will go really hard to try to get even, to the point where they end up losing way more because they're not playing very well. You take more risks and more gambles, and you find yourself in a bigger hole. Sometimes you're down because you're having bad luck. Sometimes you're down because the other player's better than you. And sometimes it's both. And that's probably what's happening here, although there's not that much luck in Cyvasse. It's closer to chess in that there isn't much luck at all. There is a little bit. But Ben should have retreated from this battlefield way sooner than he did. There's an old saying in poker, if you can't spot the sucker at the table, it's probably you. Ben was the sucker at this table. And that effect is magnified at a Cyvasse table, because at a poker table, there might be 6 or 10 people. There's 2 people at a Cyvasse table. So it narrows it down who the sucker might be. So he lost like 25,000 silver or gold or whatever it was, which is a monstrous sum. Because what happened was they play for 5,000 and Tyrion beats him. Then they play for 10,000 and Tyrion loses. Then they play 3 more times and Tyrion wins all 3 of those. So, but the style of play is more important than this wagering scenario here. So let's talk about that. Here's Tyrion's read on Ben's personality based on how he plays.
Hungry, but wary, this one. The sellsword was nearly as bad a player as the younkish lord had been, but his play was stolid and tenacious rather than bold. His opening arrays were different every time, yet all the same, conservative, defensive, passive. He does not play to win, Tyrion realized. He plays so as not to lose.
The concept of interpreting art and gaming as a window to someone's personality, well, if I could break away from A Song of Ice and Fire just for a couple seconds, that's a major personality trait of the character Thrawn from Star Wars, who we're going to apparently get more of on these new TV shows that are being launched. So, it pops up all over the place. It's an extremely good description of why Ben switched sides, too. Not because he thought the Yunkai were going to win. He's like, oh, I want to be on the winning side, but because he saw failure on Dany's side. It's a subtle difference. It sounds like the same thing, but it's not. Because if you miss that difference, you won't be able to predict his behavior. That granular decision-making comes down to that.
I just want to say right here, it really comes across when George is writing about Cyvasse that he was a really big chess player. We learned, he posted about it recently because of the Queen's Gambit, about how he used to run tournaments and that's how he was working for the weekends. So yeah, it just really comes through.
I am spacing out on the name. Oh, Unsound Variations is the name of a short story. I believe it's in Dream Songs 2, which is George's chess story. He wrote a story, it's like a sci-fi story about chess players, and it's really cool. So if you read that, you can see the jargon. You can tell it's so clear. It's like, boy, these are terms that clearly only a chess player would use. They're just like really deep into that lingo. So yeah, good call, Shea. So Ben switched sides because he saw losing on one side, not because he smelled the winning on the other side. And yes, Tyrion notes, yes, Ben is hungry. He does have ambition. Else he'd never have risen to the top of the sellsword company in the first place. But he values his life more than his ambitions. That's something about Brown Ben Plum that we know. Yes, he's ambitious, but he's also cautious. He's not the old, bold sellsword. He's the old sellsword. And Ben will make the point in his next chapter, Dany's next chapter, that is, The gold isn't worth anything if you're dead, and he thinks his odds of dying are larger with Dany's side. He's not sure what side's going to win. He just sees more of a chance of losing on one. It's not complicated at all when you look at it that way. It's actually quite predictable. And just like we hadn't seen these different people, all these power players, all these slavers from anyone's point of view but Dany, now we're seeing Brown Ben Plum's point of view from Tyrion's instead of Dany's point of view, and that's also very different because not only is Tyrion probably a better judge of character at this point, but he knows who Brown Ben Plum is, at least as far as his house goes. He doesn't know him personally, but he knows Plums. He knows Plums are Westermen. And that, as a Lannister, gives him a potential in route. Or it makes him screwed because Plum will go sell him to Cersei. But he's aware of that possibility, and he trusts his own ability to talk Ben out of doing that. But more importantly, Brown Ben Plum was putting on airs for Dany. He's like trying to act like a supplicant, until he switched sides, obviously. But with Tyrion, Brown Ben Plum isn't hiding who he is. He's not hiding his nature. When Tyrion sees that look in his eyes and is like, I don't know if I want this guy to buy me after all. Dany doesn't have those kind of reads. She doesn't have that kind of life experience yet. She's much younger. So this is, again, yet another example of foreshadowing Tyrion's value to her, to sniffing out things like this. Tyrion may have predicted Ben leaving ahead of time. I think we even said that at the time. So Yezan, too, thinking about Yezan just for a second, as gross as he is, he's clearly not an idiot. He also knows that Ben tried to win him at auction. So he saw the guy who tried to bid for Tyrion at the same time he was, now is coming in to try and win Tyrion at gambling. So Yezan's like, what does he want with Tyrion? Why does he want Tyrion so badly? Now we know why he wants him so badly. Ben was planning on killing Jorah and giving his head to Dany as a wedding gift, though I don't think that's a misread of what Dany wants there. I don't think Dany would have been like, oh, good. Also, he was going to take Tyrion to Cersei, as Tyrion is worried about, which would have been pretty wild, right? Tyrion gets all the way to within sight of Meereen, only to head right back to Westeros. It's like, I could see Meereen, but now we're leaving. Here's a great one-liner. His thoughts flash back to the beginning of his journey when his most pressing problem had been deciding which wine to drink and his mid-morning snails. Yeah, it's almost as if his attitude in viewing the world as a joke is protecting him here. It's like he thinks of everything as a joke, so he doesn't take it seriously, and that's helping him here. Because if he were to really grasp the situation he was in, it might break him. Like it seems to have broken Jorah and possibly Penny. Understandably. Like, I'm not calling them weak for that. Tyrion is the exception here. And Tyrion's journey has been so amazing. I mean, the Bridge of Dream, the Valyrian roads, Valyria itself he saw, the Rhoyne, all these haunting ruins. I mean, it's incredible. And along the way, he's had a lot of internalized story to tell. His father, Shae, Jaime, and Tysha being the main people he thinks of, and I guess Cersei as well. But as we introduce this chapter, we mentioned that these things aren't really haunting him too much this chapter. A little bit. But with his father, he's more just like thinking of things his father said. Like when he hears about the Pale Mare, he thinks of his father's advice saying, oh, disease could wipe out an army quicker than any battle he had learned from his father, right? There's no rancor or animosity attached to that memory of Tywin. It's just good advice. Like, okay, I learned something about military from my dad. And this is actually perhaps the only chapter, we'll have to do a little additional research on this, but he doesn't think about Tysha at all, either directly or indirectly. He doesn't even think the phrase "wherever whores go," which is a kind of his mantra for the book. And he does recall that his father said a Lannister is worth 10 times more than anyone else. And again, that's not really a rueful thought. It's just like something he thinks of in the moment, and he uses it as a strategy, and to talk to the crowd and to try to manipulate them. He does think of Shae, but only a little, and kind of like how Theon is slowly accepting certain truths that he had been not accepting. Tyrion's doing some of the same here. He's accepting what he did with Shay. Just a little bit. It's a slight hint that he's like, okay, I did that. It wasn't her fault, right? He doesn't come out and say that, but I get that sense that he's starting to accept that she had so little agency in all this that it wasn't just to murder her necessarily. It's really wild how organized the slave trade is. You got all these people that were on the Salisbury Corin that are just like, oh yeah, I'm already the owner of this guy. I'm already owned by this guy. And they're just like, okay, get in this line if you're a pre-owned slave. You know, it's like, whoa, this level of how big a part of these large societies are is kind of mind-blowing. And it's disturbing. But again, this is not unrealistic to certain real-world societies that manage their got disgustingly creative with how they manage slavery. Now, speaking of his father, it's interesting that he doesn't curse his own father, but he does curse Penny's father for teaching her to behave and to be so meek here. Now, this is where Tyrion is, it's bitterness more than it is rational, because her way of life, the way that her father taught her, was very valuable to them when they were on the Salisbury Corin. Fitting in, being what people wanted them to be, being small, proverbially, not literally, because obviously they're small literally. I mean, like, not drawing a lot of attention to themselves and only making people laugh, like being an object of humor and not drawing attention for being something that people want to be superstitious about or be angry towards. Just try to be as literally, as proverbially small as they are literally. This bothers Tyrion, but he doesn't realize how much it saved their lives earlier. Now, though, at least what's on his side is he's right, that his attitude is the thing that's going to have a chance to save them. Him being focused, him beefing himself up, acting more important, that's actually going to help them. It's going to help them survive. What's funny, too, is a little more irony, maybe, is that if I were Tyrion's father, I would be really proud of him for how tough-minded he is in this situation, how he's not letting all this break him, how he's not showing fear or despair as he's literally being sold. Of course, Tywin would just be embarrassed by the whole thing, and that's just another reason to hate Tywin. I mean, being embarrassed is fine, but if that's the only thing you're feeling, then yeah, screw you. And Tyrion tells Jon way back in the Game of Thrones, in his second chapter, if I had been born a peasant, they might have left me out to die or sold me to some slaver's grotesquerie. And here we are. That's exactly what's happened. He's been sold directly to a slaver's grotesquerie. And, well, yeah, it is grotesque. And there's even more fulfillment here in the feast itself. When he had attended Joffrey's wedding and first seen Penny and Oppo, Tyrion had been commanded by Joffrey to joust with them. And he said, well, only if you joust with me, and because I'm the only one you're the only one I can beat. And then Joffrey poured wine on him, right? And then we get to this scene where he's told by Nurse, don't spill any wine or it'll go bad for you. And of course, so much of this is an extension of the Purple Wedding, because that's why he had to flee. So he had to be Yazan's cupbearer. Oh boy. And just Tyrion being a server has got to be a big, strange change for him. I mean, he's been, ultra rich his whole life. How many times has he ever even taken notice of who's been serving his wine? And now he's got to be that person. So really, it might do him some good to see what it's like to live on the other side of things. It might give him some good perspective. Because Dany's had that. Dany was sold. And that's part of what that informs her character. She knows kind of what it's like to some degree.
Undercover boss. Undercover lord.
What Tyrion needs to do is get naked and hide inside a couch. I do like the clever line when he says, I bid 10,000 silvers for myself. I'm good for it. I am. My father told me I must always pay my debts. Because that's really clever, right? It's a smart way to communicate who he is to Westerosi. Joe Buckley calls it the Westerosi bat signal, that only a Westerosi would see that, but they'll see it brightly. Right, that is a very identifiable phrase, not only for a Westerosi, but for a Plum, who is a house in the Westerlands. So, good writing, good cleverness by Tyrion. It's maybe one of the most simple examples to point to of how old Tyrion coming back. Clash of Kings style Tyrion when he's constantly thinking and really good at it. Jorah, meanwhile, seems quite broken. While Penny is frozen in fear, Jorah's just gone inside. The news that Dany has married his Dar has just broken him more so than slavery, it seems. And that just goes to show you the depths of his feelings. As much as I don't like Jorah that much, wow, you really got to have intense feelings to feel that way. And boy, was he lying to himself. He was never going to marry her. She was never going to marry him. I mean, to him, this is some he lost something by her marrying someone else. Nah, she was never. He was holding out hope she would do multiple husbands and everything, though. So he really was lying to himself. Now, why does Tyrion save Jorah? That's really interesting. I asked a lot of y'all about that. I got a wide variety of answers, and it's not certain. One thing I like to point to is, well, Tyrion's old line about having a soft spot for crippled bastards and broken things. Jorah's pretty broken right now as far as people that goes. And maybe there's a little bit of pragmatism on Tyrion's side here, thinking maybe Jorah could be useful to them escaping later.
I think
something like that.
I think, yeah, that he thinks he'd be useful, and that in general he's useful. He's big.
Yeah, he'll owe him a favor. Like, I saved you. Of course, if Jorah may be like, I don't care.
Tyrion's so tiny. Yeah, I feel like it's good to have a big brute like Jorah around.
He's my bear. Yeah, he really kind of is.
Yeah, we know Lannisters and their bears.
So it certainly, some of it is kindness / pity. Some of it, I think, is a little bit. You got to give Tyrion a little bit of credit here for this level of compassion, even if some of it's pragmatism, even if a lot of it's pragmatism, because he's certainly takes some responsibility for Penny, even if it's a different level of instinct. So I do give him some credit here. This Tyrion version of Tyrion is a lot more fun to read than, even though this scenario is not so fun to read.
By the way, I think part of why he would feel bad for Jorah is that Tyrion can relate to being like a sad sack of a man.
Yeah, he was very recently in a similar spot. Sort of
kind
over
of still
a woman,
is,
too.
but yeah.
Yeah. Being in exile, yeah, they do have more things in common. We talked about that back Widow of the Waterfront when they were first together, that they do actually have a lot in common that they don't like to admit. Neither of them wanted to admit it, really. Although Tyrion was thinking it. So the slave mark here, instead of a tattoo or something like that, a brand was really common. Instead, you have these fancy golden collars, which Tyrion is like, okay, that's actually pretty good because it's not permanent. It's something you can actually remove. And it's another sign of his strength that he's actually able to find positive things to look at positively amidst so much horror. Also, little bells, though. I wonder if that's meant to have any symbolic meaning, that they are all wearing little bells that tinkle. It's almost like they've been defeated, in a sense. But that might just be, hey, bells are everywhere. And another just really disturbing moment comes when Sweets tells them that Yezan got some awful disease in Zathorios, and they say, so deny him nothing, because if you can make him forget that he's dying even for a minute, he'll be very grateful. And the implication of deny him nothing has a distinct sexual overtone to it. And a guy who looks like that, who is that gross, who is that greedy, who has a disease from Zathorios also? Yikes. Like, this is worse than Jabba the Hutt, but that is who comes to mind. A really gross crime boss type guy that treats people like objects. And yeah. So talk about Tyrion serving as an observer. I mean, he's just watching all these awful people party and drink and be awful. We've seen these characters before, but inside Meereen, and again, this is different because it's Tyrion, quote, looked at everything and everyone, which not just the slaves and the people, but the siege lines. And Tyrion has a better understanding of military stuff than Dany does at this point, too. Now, he's not an expert, but he's been in a lot of battles. Dany's been in a couple, too, but he was clearly brought up by someone that has a lot of experience, where Dany is learning as she goes. Here's an important quote, his take of the camps.
Some camps were orderly, with the tents arrayed around a fire pit in concentric circles, weapons and armor stacked around the inner ring, horse lines outside. Elsewhere, pure chaos seemed to reign. The dry, scorched plains around Meereen were flat and bare and treeless for long leagues, but the youngest ships had brought lumber and hides up from the south, enough to raise 6 huge trebuchets. They were arrayed on 3 sides of the city, all but the riverside, surrounded by piles of broken stone and casks of pitch and resin just waiting for a torch.
Just waiting for a torch. Yeah, so compare that to like the Golden Company's very orderly, disciplined camp, or Jaime's campaign where he sends out scouts even though there's no armies in the field to oppose him. That kind of discipline compared to this, these are not war leaders. These are slavers playing at war. And this lack of discipline, this sloppiness, this expectation, this arrogance that they're just going to win is overwhelming here. And that last line really says it all. A cask of pitch and resin just waiting for a torch. Yeah, the whole thing's going to go up. And we're reminded that the Masters destroyed the olive groves and other trees to deny Dany wood and food for her siege. It's a similar kind of thing. It's the same kind of arrogance. They didn't care about who suffered because of that. It's about the possession and the power. And it's ridiculous, right? These characters are silly. They're not supposed to be otherwise. We're not supposed to look at the girl general and the little pigeon and be like, and to be intimidated. We're not even supposed to think anyone's to be intimidated. No one has been. The sellswords laugh at them. We're supposed to laugh at them. We're supposed to be disgusted by them as well, but we're supposed to laugh at that at the same time. And they're not capable. We're not supposed to really be afraid of them either, just as the characters aren't. So this is all Battle of Fire setup, and you can see that why Barristan has a point. He's like, look at them. Let's attack. What are they going to do? They're not going to band together. They have no idea what they're doing. Let's go get them. Let's not sit here while the Pale Mare kills us. Those guys are weak. Attack them. And of course, Barristan knows war better than anyone in this vicinity that I can think of. So I would listen to him. Real briefly, too, more extension of Dany's story here. We see some sadness. The person who is sold right after Tyrion and Penny, it's another young girl, stripped naked and sold. And it's like an Eroa. This is another Eroa. Dany thinks how she made 10,000 Eroas. Well, there's one of them. Lot 98. And she can't do anything about it. And she's right. Dany's like, I wanted to save them all, but I can't. She's powerless to stop it because there's just too many of them. And this one's happening inside of her walls. But she's right. She's not even aware it's happening. She can guess at it because she can see the slave march. There must be young girls being sold because everyone else is being sold. But specifically, she doesn't know this girl. She doesn't know her plight. She just knows that there are people out there who have been enslaved, and she can't save them all, and she hates that. Another little quick miscellaneous note here. Tyrion lies to Penny about, look, golden collar, they're gonna protect you. They're treating you well. But of course, we know that's not true because we've seen how they treat luxury goods. They're willing to just throw them away for at their cost because it's all spent for their pleasure. But he also talks about the Valyrian glyphs on the collar, which is one of the details he points to show how fancy it is. And that is a reminder, Nina caught this, that when Dany was married, she was given a heavy golden torque emblazoned with ancient Valyrian glyphs too, which was kind of similar. Dany herself liked it at first. Then she realized how similar it was to a golden collar because Drogo's slaves also wore golden collars. So, yeah, not actually so good. Okay, so also at the feast was, besides the girl general, whose name is Malaza, we had the Tattered Prince was there. Tyrion doesn't know who that is, but he was there, along with Brown Ben Plum. There was a 2-headed slave that has filed teeth, and that makes me think of Melis the Monstrous and the city of Mantaris that has some 2-headed people. And this slave is from Mantaris. Sophia from Flick Marks writes that Tyrion likens how people enjoy the dwarf joust way more out here, just as much as they did back in Droft's wedding, aka the Purple Wedding. And there's another little tie-in, which is that when they perform the joust, Yurkaz's face actually turns purple because he's laughing so hard. Just like Joffrey's face turns purple when he drinks the wine. And, well, Yurkaz doesn't die during this feast, but he's going to die next week, when he gets trampled, when Drogon shows up at Daznak's pit. Sorry about your luck, Yurkaz. A couple of y'all pointed to a really important line, and I was thinking about this one too. I was thinking about where to put it in this chapter breakdown. Well, I put it at the end, right here. Last comment about this chapter, the line, contempt, the universal tongue. Yeah, because there's so many different languages flying around. Tyrion doesn't understand what's being said always, but you can read contempt in someone's eyes. In fact, I once read a book on relationships written by a psychiatrist and some researchers who studied facial expressions. They broke it down into 72 distinct facial expressions that people have. The biggest indicator that a relationship is going to fail, and they studied this for a long time, like a decade of research of new couples. The number one signal from facial expressions that a relationship was going to fail was disgust, which is pretty much contempt. That's the same thing. Those are synonyms. So if one or both members of a couple roll their eyes at each other regularly or express disgust, probably not going to last. That's a bad sign, because it shows how much little respect you have for that person. And how are you going to love someone that you don't respect? How are you going to make that work? And the reason I bring that up here at the end is because there's a lot of contempt on display in Jaime 1, the North of the South, a.k.a. a tree of 1,000 ravens in one. Nicely placed right after his brother's chapter. I'm very much enamored of this choice for a chapter location, the geographic location as well, because a massive portion of A Song of Ice and Fire is told in King's Landing and the Riverlands, but this is our first chapter in either of those locations since A Feast for Crows, which is, we're pretty deep into this book, and it's a big book. It's the biggest of them all. So clever of George to ease us back into the South with a location that's kind of northern, right? And locked into this rivalry so ancient, it predates accurate records. So, indeed, as George writes for Jaime's first line.
Raventree Hall was old. I can't believe I messed up a quote that was 4 words long.
Only 5 syllables. No, 6 syllables, too.
Oh, I see you got that wrong.
Yeah, actually, I can't do it either. That's why Shea reads the quotes.
Also, so you can take a drink of your drink.
That, too. That's very useful. Anyway, she said it. It is old. He said it. Jaime, Shea, George, Raventree Hall is old. And Jaime has the eye of a trained commander, and he notes the square towers here, something no one builds with anymore. They don't do that anymore if they have battles in mind. I mean, you might build a square tower if you're just building like some other kind of tower that has no wars in mind. But he also takes note that this place is called Blackwood Vale, yet there's no wood. So these two things together, there's a description that tells us how old it is, or a couple descriptions, plus he just flat out says it. So it's just a lot of initial effort to just point out that this place isn't just old, it's real old. It's ancient. It's sometimes easy to forget that the Blackwoods aren't probably natives of the Riverlands. They probably came from the north and moved here a long time ago, in somewhat prehistoric times. Sort of like how the Manderleys went from south to north, the Blackwoods went from north to south, though well before the Manderleys made their move. This is something we discuss in our Blackwood 2-part series. Well, in part 1, the ancient history stuff is covered. So plug for that, and fittingly, the episode and the follow-up, Blackwood 2, was co-written by Joe Buckley, who has a few things to say about the castle. This is another good time to plug his book, Great Castles of Westeros. The Blackwoods have been a major part of the Riverlands storyline since the beginning. Tytos was cited as one of the heroes of the early battles, as the man who rescued Edmure from captivity before he was eventually taken captive again. And we got to remember that the Blackwoods aren't an obvious big player. They're not like they don't stand out as being really powerful. They are powerful, and they have a lot of prestige because of, well, Westerosi houses respect ancientness. Being old carries a lot of weight to it. And they were once kings, which is also a big deal. They care about that sort of thing. This is also really relevant to talking about topics within the Dance of the Dragons. When we get to the show House of the Dragon, there's probably going to be some Blackwood action. We got some characters that have relationships here and there. Some secondary characters are Blackwoods, like Red Rob Rivers. Alysanne Blackwood. I hesitate to even call her a secondhand because she might be a top-tier character. We'll have to see how they go. Although we probably won't see her in season 1. But Bloody Ben Blackwood as well. I mean, there's a lot of potential for some really interesting Blackwood characters in House of the Dragon. So I'm really looking forward to that possibility, though. Don't want to get my hopes up too much on like all of them being on screen. We'll probably maybe only get one of those 3. But maybe we'll get them all. So there's a lot to do. There's a lot of history here, not just for the series, but for other Game of Thrones content. And that doesn't even include the fact that Brynden Rivers, Bloodraven, is a Blackwood. So if you were to like add up all the scripted episodes History of Westeros has done, there's an awful lot of Blackwood content beyond just those 2 Blackwood episodes, because all these Bloodraven stuff constantly ties into it. We talk about them a lot in the dance. Yeah, it just pops up a lot. I could shout out a lot of our own episodes, but I think you guys kind of have an idea already. And Bloodraven, I mean, he's so important too. Like, his story hasn't fully been explored within the series. It's a lot of it's kind of, the profile is raised by, well, people like us. And he might be saving the world, right? He might be orchestrating saving the world. He's the guy training Bran and all that. So we got to be on the lookout for some clues here and seeing maybe the influence and what's going on. He talks about, in Bran 3, or was it Bran 2? Doesn't really matter. He talks about how people are still named for him. Brynden, right? And multiple Bryndens come up in this chapter. First of all, they talk about the Blackfish, who was probably named for Brynden. That was specifically raised in Bran's chapter, who's not here. You know, Jaime asks about the Blackfish. Did you have him here? And they're like, nah. And that makes sense. Why would Blackfish go to a siege? I'm going to go hang out in Raventree Hall to hide, where they have no food and they're under siege. That's a terrible place to hide. And why would he go to Jonas Bracken, who has switched sides? So, yeah. So Jaime has to ask, but he's not expecting much, and yeah. But Brynden Blackwood is also the heir to Raventree Hall. Arguably, that's who Jaime should have taken as a hostage instead of this Hoster Blackwood kid. Which, by the way, these names really tell you where the loyalties are. Hoster Blackwood, Brynden Blackwood. You got Hoster Tully, Brynden Rivers, Brynden Tully. Yeah, these names are very telling. And, but they didn't take Brynden as a hostage. They did take Bookish Hoster instead. And, interestingly, too, we make a big deal out of how he's the last one to surrender. Tytos is like, I held out longer than anyone else, and Jaime gives him credit for that. But I give him credit for that too. But the cynical side of me is like, yeah, but he would have surrendered sooner if it hadn't been his pride, right? It was because the Brackens have them besieged. He didn't want to surrender to the Brackens. Had Jaime shown up earlier, they might not have been the last to surrender. It's just that they didn't want to surrender to the Brackens. So maybe don't give them too much credit for that. But some still, because it looks good. It's good optics, even if the reasons behind it aren't quite what we make of them. And that tree, though, one of the great features of Raventree Hall is this really cool tree. That's something we spend a good deal talking about, not only in our Werewoods episode, but the Blackwoods episode too, especially imagining what it was like when this tree was alive, because it was once alive. This castle was built when it was alive, and the Brackens supposedly poisoned it, according to Tytos. And, well, how do you do that? What poison did they kill it with? I would like to know that. Maybe a mystery for later. The ravens that come there every night. Interesting. What's that all about? Is that... One theory I have is that it's related to the same thing happening with Bran. Bran's consciousness is sort of drawn towards his home. He goes to the Winterfell heart tree. Is that maybe what Bloodraven's doing? He's drawn back to this raven tree because it's his home. Problem with that theory, though, is that apparently these ravens have been coming to this dead tree for well before Bloodraven's birth, let alone, his quote unquote death. He was born in 175. And it sounds like these ravens have been coming to this tree for way longer than that. But maybe Bran looks through this tree also, if he can. I mean, it's a dead tree, so I don't know how that works, but maybe he can. So, as far as the negotiations go, we'll talk about Jonas Bracken just for a minute. I'm going to compare him briefly to Brown Ben Plum, that the loyalty of sellswords versus the loyalty of lords. And it's the lords love to denigrate sellswords, but when you really get down to it, there's not as big a difference as it seems like. They're all mostly out for themselves. And I don't even necessarily mean that in a selfish way. I mean, they just want to survive, right? They put their own lives first, which is rational, right? I mean, there's more lies told about the honor of these lords. About, like, for example, this thing with the Blackwoods. Like, yeah, there was honor in lasting that long, but part of it was just stubbornness, right? And here, some of the same thing is going on. Bracken wants rewards for turning on his liege lord first. It's like, yeah, but we came to your side first. And they get into this kind of philosophical discussions like, well, who's more loyal? The guy who fights us longer? Because he stayed loyal to who is the first person he swore to? Isn't that person more honorable? Shouldn't we trust them more, even though you switched sides sooner? Isn't it because you switched sides sooner that we should trust the Blackwoods more than you? It's a really interesting dive into what loyalty really means and what honor really means, and how a lot of it's kind of bull. And of course, it's great that this comes out through Jaime, who is one of our viewpoints, one of our most important windows into all the contradictions of that exist within the cultures of the high nobility of Westeros and other places too. There's so many contradictions and hypocrisies, and here we're seeing some of them play out through these negotiations over who gets rewards. Like, you're rewarding them for being disloyal because they were disloyal to your benefit. Like, they came to you, but still, how are you upholding these values in a society where honor is important, and you're also offering people inducements to go against their honor, right? There's just so many blatant contradictions here. And usually these contradictions are hand waved away. Like someone like Tywin would just be like, okay, we don't talk about the contradictions. We just accept them and we move forward. You bend the knee, you give us money, and you behave. Who cares about the hypocrisies and all the contradictions? That's, but Jaime's not like that as much. He actually debates these things and wants it to make sense, but it doesn't. And, well, especially when Jonas Bracken brings up things like, look, man, your people, you sent Gregor Clegane at us. You sent Vargo Hoat at us. Like, what was I supposed to do? Not switch to your side? Like, you're going to call me disloyal to Robb Stark? You killed a bunch of my people. The Mountain raped my daughter. Like, was I supposed to fight against that? Was I supposed to suffer more of that sort of thing? Yeah, like, there's no right answer here. And that is where we get to the problem. The core root problem here that explains why the Brackens and Blackwoods have never found peace. Within these contradictions and hypocrisies exists the space for this conflict to never fall off. There's no room for a true peace amidst all this dishonesty. It's just they pause, right? And Nina writes it really well. This is not a lasting peace. They're both starving. They both still hate each other. They don't feel like they were treated super fairly. There's hostages involved. There's nothing about this scenario that says this time it's going to work. There's nothing about, they're going to be struggling to have food. They may start fighting each other again because they need to survive. It comes down to survival, not greed. So, on one hand, we see how there's a lot of peace here, and maybe there's some sense of things could turn around, but I think that's a bit of an illusion. I think overwhelmingly, the things happening in this chapter are ominous because no matter how much little break from the war there might be, hanging over everything is winter, and they don't have time to get more food. And Jaime, in the back of his head, he's thinking about, how are we going to feed these people? He's realizing it's his responsibility. Remember back in the Feast for Crows, for a minute he's like, how is my dad going to, oh wait, it's my job now. My dad's gone. I have to feed them. Uh-oh. And you can even see this in the negotiations. The bitterness between the two houses plays out even as they give Jaime advice on how to screw the other, right? He says, take his daughter. He's going to hate that. Or give him honey tree and its hives. It's going to rot his teeth. Like they'll take any excuse to get one up on each other. But it's a little bit under the radar there. The white elephant concept comes back yet again. What good is, for example, when he says, I'll give him a honey tree in those hives because it'll rot his teeth. He's telling the truth almost. It's not the honey that's going to rot his teeth, but what the hell good are a bunch of beehives when it's about to be winter? They're worthless in winter, as far as I understand it. They have to hibernate, right? And the same goes for these other villages that he gives up. They're not going to produce food right now. They're a burden in the short term because they need to be fed. So Blackwood's like, yeah, take that. I don't have to. These are mouths I have to feed that I don't have to worry about anymore. Maybe I'll take those lands back from you back when things are better. But you manage them now when it's hard. You pay the rent, the taxes, pay the upkeep. We'll be back to take it from you later. So that's the white elephant concept of giving a gift that you can't afford, and so it kind of ruins you. And I think that's sort of under the radar here with these negotiations. He's like, yeah, I take these lands. I have my pride. I don't want to give you, the land where my forebears are buried. But ultimately, I can afford to part with some of these because they're actually a burden. And back to the hostages, right? Hoster Blackwood's kind of neat for us because we get this history lesson, but we see too that the Hoster Blackwood or Tytos Blackwood comes out and says he knows who he's dealing with. He says, I know who I'm dealing with, Kingslayer. And Jaime, wants to make sure they all understand each other, which is, yeah, they're not friends. They're not, yes, they were able to deal honorably with each other, but they both know it's not unlikely that they'll be at war again at some time in the future. This is a truce, not a peace, right? It's definitely temporary. Something else in the background here is Jaime thinks about Cersei quite a bit. He still has that mantra. It's the first time in a while, though, because, of course, we haven't had Jaime chapters, but his line, she's been effing Lancel and Osmond Kettleblack and Moonboy for all I know. We haven't actually seen that since A Feast for Crows, Jaime 3. So as he's thinking about her again, he's starting to think about the letter and all that with her saying, I need you, I love you, and all that. And this comes alongside him starting to notice other women. He's not going to hook up with this Hildy girl that he finds with Jonos Bracken, but he actually takes note of her and is like slightly attracted to her or whatever. And he looks at her in ways that he doesn't usually look at women. And that's very telling because he's always been so loyal to Cersei about that, even as she's not. So it seems like his discipline in loyalty is slipping a bit, and for good reason. I mean, right? I love this exchange. It's funny yet also kind of sad. Here we go. Quote.
And what is it you like in a woman, my lord?
Innocence.
In a woman, I said, not a daughter.
It's funny, right? But it's also kind of sad, like I said, because he does not think about Myrcella. That's his daughter, and she is rarely in his thoughts. And yeah, that's a bit of it's a fair criticism of Jaime, even though there's this, you got to take into account this strange scenario where he's supposed to not pretend to be his mother, or her mother. So it's all very odd. It's kind of hard to get that straight in your mind because I don't know how to understand that situation, right? It's like who has a comparison to that? Also, he just knows Tommen better because he's a Kingsguard and he has to be around him and guard him. So he's just in his presence more, while Myrcella well, she's been in Dorne all this time, and really, Jaime couldn't be around Myrcella a lot, even if he wanted to be. So we should, some of the criticism perhaps is fair to not give him for that reason. But also this whole attraction business is a setup too for the fact that right after Hildy comes Brienne, and even though it's only for a moment, she's so awesome. We love Brienne, so when she shows up, even though we know she's going to show up, we know this scene is brief. It touches the heart briefly as she touches the hilt of her sword, which is a really meaningful gesture, very symbolic, because he thinks about it. He's like, oh, Oathkeeper. And the highlighting of this, as Joe writes, gives the evidence of how Brienne got out of that pickle. She yelled sword, which was one of her two choices. And of course, it's also a reminder of the promise to him, which is sad because Jaime's like, oh, okay, she's trustworthy. I can trust her. But, well, she is trustworthy, but she's in a situation that Jaime might understand ruefully, which is in order to keep one promise, he has to break another. Well, in this case, it's her. She has to break her oath to him in order to keep Podrick alive, and herself as well, who, she cares about herself less, but to save Podrick and all that, she had to lie and break her oath. So this is the kind of vengeance and payback that Jaime has just been talking about with Hoster Blackwood. They're talking about cycles of revenge and how, there's always a deeper concession that prevents them from having a lasting peace. There's always something in the past or some new catalyst, perhaps because the past was never truly buried. So let's talk about the history a little bit and how these conflicting oaths play out a bit. Again, Tywin Lannister hangs over all this. Jaime makes a big mistake here. He misunderstands it. Basically, he points to his father's attitude. He's like, look what happened to the Rains. Like, the Rains don't bother the Lannisters because my father wiped them out. But Tywin wasn't justified in wiping out the Rains. We talked about it. We're basically talking about it as a last resort. You only slaughter everyone when there's no hope of peace ever. And the Rains and the Lannisters weren't like some back and forth for centuries type of they hate each other forever type situation. No, this was a single generation problem. It was a problem that came up during Tywin's father's generation and his own when he was young. It wasn't some long-running feud that couldn't be resolved. Ditto the Red Wedding. That wasn't some long-running feud between Stark and Lannister. Tywin didn't go straight to destroying the Riverlands because that's what always happens when, it's not like some fallback plan that here we go again. No, Tywin went way above and beyond what was necessary. And Jaime's falling into the trap of thinking that worked. He's not realizing the net effect of that, even though he's aware of it. It's like he's not making the connection in his head that all this famine that's about to strike the Riverlands is his father's fault, right? It was not necessarily necessary. I think Jaime on some level thinks, well, we had a war. Of course all this happened. It did not have to go this way. It did not have to be so bad. The Riverlands did not have to be completely torched for the Lannisters to win this war. The offshoot of all this, Jaime specifically notes that his father's hand in this destruction and all this, but he's not realizing how much hatred that sowed. Yes, the crops are gone, and in its place are the seeds of hatred. He destroyed the capacity of the Riverlands to exist as their subject post War of Five Kings. They aren't capable of surviving without Lannister help now, and the Lannisters aren't capable of doing that, probably. So it was very much self-destructive on Tywin's end, too. If Tywin had survived all this, he would have been struggling, to make it all work. So by suggesting that Blackwood wipe out Bracken or Bracken wipe out Blackwood, he's learning the wrong lesson. He's not realizing that destruction is not a solution so quickly. it's only a solution. It's only a last resort. But for Tywin, it's a first resort. It's the first thing he does. And, well, that's his strategy, but it's evil. So there's a moment where Jaime has a fond memory of Tywin when he's talking to his Hoster kid, and he kind of has a moment where he's forgetting what Tyrion does. He kind of falls back into old habits. But again, the shadow of Tywin hangs over all this. He's thinking about before the rebellion. He's thinking about, or during the rebellion, rather, before the War of Five Kings, I should say, when Tywin had these kids killed. And because he's talking about children and having, well, in order for Blackwood or Bracken to wipe out the other, it would involve killing a lot of children. And how can you ever have the upper hand in terms of honor and ethics when you've done something like that? Jaime perfectly expresses Tywin's point of view at the end of the chapter without realizing just what makes that viewpoint so wrong and so self-destructive, right? Obliterating an enemy, crushing anyone who stands in your way. It's the plan that Tywin has used many times, but we haven't seen. It's been so recent that we haven't seen the long term, how bad it's going to be, and Jaime doesn't realize that either. For example, another example of where this hasn't happened: the Starks. Right now, they might be wishing that they had wiped out the Boltons. Maybe they should have wiped out the Boltons so long ago, because clearly the Boltons have still were looking for opportunities to get one over on the Starks. But it's an example of enmity that hadn't been resolved over countless centuries, that one side still didn't wipe out the other, and for the most part existed peacefully together. So that's why this is a false peace. It's only temporary. Yeah, they're gonna fight again, and until someone steps up and settles it for good, well, we're gonna be right back to this again. So on to Pennytree. They go to Pennytree, where some of the same lessons are expressed. Pennytree's in better shape than most villages because it's noted to be a royal fief, meaning it's actually royal land, and that's probably why they had stone walls there to hide behind. All these other villages don't have that kind of funding. There's a lot of cool off-page references here. Pennytree is a very strong nominee for where the next Dunk and Egg story is going to be. The Village Hero is the working title, according to George. And this could be the village, the Pennytree itself. It stands between Bracken and Blackwood lands, or has often. It's belonged to one, then the other, then the one, then the other, and eventually it became a royal fief. And this might be the story of how it became a royal fief. I like that theory. Nina is like headcanon for her, so she might be getting to do a victory lap if that's how it comes out. But there's also some other hidden references here. It's neat that Hoster Blackwood is the one telling us all these stories with Dunk and Egg vibes, and Hoster is 7 feet tall, so is Dunk, basically, although, okay, Dunk is 6'11". I guess Hoster probably is not, maybe also 6'11". Who knows? He's close. And Duncan the Small and Jenny of Oldstones might have their meeting near this area, because it's somewhat near Oldstones. And if Pennytree was already a royal fief around that time, it would be a reasonable place for him to be if he's in that area, considering it would be royal land and he's the prince, the heir to the throne. So there's definitely more on some of these stories if you want to check out our Blackfire series. The end of it has all the Bloodraven stuff. The beginning is where Aegon IV is, and Aegon IV is the one that had a Bracken and Blackwood mistress. Well, actually 2 Bracken mistresses. And a lot of this stuff ties into that. And in fact, Dunk and Egg is very likely going to deal with some of that too. So if you're into Dunk and Egg and Aegon IV and all that time period, there's a lot of richness there to be held. Okay. Couple comments from you. Super chat from Amy Blackfire. Love your shirt today, Aziz. I have the same one in gray. Oh, cool. Awesome. Thank you both for all you do. My mom's birthday is in 2 days. She doesn't watch. Can we get a happy B-Day for her? Her name is Gail. Absolutely. Happy birthday to Gail Blackfire?
Blackfire, yeah. Gail Blackfire. You're going to spell it, We
got to
Gael.
Oh, yeah.
Just like in the books, I guess there is a Gail.
There is a Gail, the winter princess or whatever.
Yeah, Alsan Harris's daughter.
That's so cool.
But
excellent.
Also, another congratulations to Amy on her betrothal.
Yes, that's right. Yes, congrats on your pending nuptials. Very cool. Congrats for that. Yes. Also, super chat from Dan Windsor, who just says H. H. Thank you, Dan, for the H. I guess that's a hello or a happy Sunday.
Yeah, I asked him. It was just H.
Cool. Well, H. All right, Dan, we appreciate it. Thanks for the great support. And, well, one last comment about this chapter. It's possible that there's BWB spies at the Raventree Siege. After all, Brienne shows up pretty quickly after Pennytree, so maybe they were keeping an eye on that. And it's an somewhat easy thing to keep an eye on. As Jaime noted, they were getting slack on the siege. The siege had worn on for so long. Discipline was starting to fall. One suggestion comes from our friends over at Radio Westeros. Shout out Radio Westeros. That Hildy herself, the girl with Jonas Bracken, could be a spy for the Brotherhood. Entirely possible. But if not her, there's other candidates that maybe were off page. Makes a lot of sense given the timing of Brienne finding Jaime. Okay. Last chapter today, John 10, A Red Wedding with No Deaths, a.k.a. How I Married Your Magnar. It's the third and final wedding of A Dance with Dragons. There's been so many weddings in the books, but just staying in this book alone, the first one was brutal. The second was unhappy. And this one, well, it's actually pretty happy. It's a pretty good wedding. As Joe writes, George is throwing us a bone here. And it's a different kind of wedding, though. It's unusual. It's a mixture of different things and cultures, and there's a lot to like about it here. Here's the first line.
R'hllor, sang Melisandre, her arms upraised against the falling snow. You are the light in our eyes, the fire in our hearts, the heat in our loins. Will you sing that now, Aziz? It says she sang it.
You are the light in our eyes, the fire in our hearts, the heat in our loins.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that. That was better than I could have even imagined.
I don't think Melisandre sounds like that, but it'll do. And it's really apt, right? Because this chapter is something of a light in the dark. For once, R'hllor actually kind of comes off that way as the flame pushing away the shadows. Because this is one of the happier chapters we get. It's a fascinating scene, too. It's full of symbolic richness. It's wide open to interpretations. This chapter alone, there's a lot of ink spilled on this chapter, interpreting it in a variety of ways, and just the beauty of it. The feedback from you guys on this chapter from our different social media platforms is just overwhelming. Just so much love for this scene, so much love for Alice Karstark. Yeah, a real happy, like it says, it's a real light in the dark. Nina writes, it's one of the most beautiful moments in the whole series because it's such a unifying moment, fittingly given that marriages are one of the most explicit symbols of unity. The rancor between Stark and Karstark is symbolically undone because Alice Karstark would be Lady of Carhold, is being married by a guy with a Stark background. And it's sort of repairing the breach caused by Robb's execution of Rickard, because it's showing friendship between these houses. The witnesses are free folk and Night's Watchmen, who are, you know, not all the brothers are there, as we'll talk about in a minute, but there's a lot of them there. And Night's Watch and free folk at the same party? That is a really big deal. Southron Knights and Northern Nobles there too, including some older Northern lords who are the kind that often are highly prejudiced against free folk and Southerners, really. So it's really nice to see this. It's a cross-cultural marriage. It's a sign of peace between peoples that have been at war for longer than anyone could count. As the Green Grace says, peace is the pearl beyond price. And though she's not super honest about some of what she means with that, it's still pretty true, right? It's still, I mean, you can't really have peace with slavery, but that's not really an association here, not as directly anyway. Also, like I was touching on briefly, Nina writes the same. R'hllor and R'hlorism actually displayed in a positive light, pun intended, but it's a religion that does have positive association for us, maybe in the future, as maybe not as a great thing to be a part of in terms of culturally, but as a requirement to saving the world, as a tool to stopping winter, it might be invaluable in that sense. The language Melisandre uses in her prayers are not just beautiful, but they emphasize R'hllor's role as a protector in this darkness. The stars that guard us in the dark of night is one of the lines. And she says, the strength for those who have to walk through the, quote, black veil of night. They'll face this world's darkness together is part of the ceremony, part of the wedding vows for this couple to uphold. And yeah, so the language behind their wedding vows is very much speaks to the coming threat that faces all humanity. It's a really neat microcosm of that. I mean, it is still a political marriage, which we're very used to, but for once the woman is liberated by the political marriage instead of tied down like Dany or Sansa, or worse, like Jane Poole. Now, to be clear, she is forced into this, but it's a different kind of force. It's the force of not having a lot of choices. It's the force of circumstance, of lack of options, rather, not the force of sword point, rather, like Cregan Stark wanted it to be. It's not the kind of force of, you're a woman, so you have no say in it. That's what's trying to be forced on her by Cregan and Arnulf, and Jon realizes that Stannis, too, would force that on her. None of them would give much weight to what she wants. So in order to do the right thing, he's got to, well, again, he has to break one of his vows. More on that in a minute. First of all, why he arranges the marriage. It's not just about doing the right thing. There's a lot of pragmatism here from his own perspective. It's just really a perfect solution other than the vow-breaking part. For one thing, the Magnar is mad at Jon. He still has this, like, you killed my father attitude. So he's behaving to this point, but it's not something that would go well if it's not addressed. It's a sort of Damocles hanging over his head. Jon needs to address the fact that there's 200 Thens who worship their leader, and that leader does not like Jon Snow. It has flat out said, why fight for you? Why not kill you? Now, he said that, right? So there's no chance of peace between the free folk, the Then's free folk, and Jon Snow's black brothers. Other free folk are willing to join or be allies or what have you, but not this batch. So he's got to get rid of them one way or another. And he's not just going to have them murdered, for one thing. That's not what Jon Snow would do. Second of all, how would he do that? There's 200 of them. So this is a pretty darn good solution. It takes care of the Carhold problem. It takes care of the ethical conundrum with Alice. It gets the Thens, it makes them allies of an ally of his, if not a direct ally of him. And, well, he's also doing what he wanted to do in terms of facilitating alliances between the free folk and the North. What better opportunity than an actual marriage? Now, there's other people sniffing around like Axel Florent and Sir Patrick. Sir Patrick wanted Alice for himself. Axel Florent wants Val, and those two are gross. We'll talk about them more later. But Sir Patrick, he doesn't bring any men. There's not 200 Sir Patricks to help Alice fight for Carhold. So that aspect he doesn't bring that to the table. But Stannis might have given her to him if he had been around. So he can't afford to wait. Now, but beyond that too, it's in Stannis' best interest. Jon is pretty much on Stannis' side. Let's be honest about it. He's sometimes trying to skirt the line, but he knows the Boltons are bad news, and he's very much chosen to fight and help Stannis over the Boltons, even as much as he tries to technically say he hasn't. It's not really true. Even this move is very much pro Stannis, anti Bolton. He doesn't want the Karstarks to get Carhold, the ones who were gonna betray Stannis, and he sends news. He says he tells Stannis, "Look, the Karstarks are going to betray you." Like, he's blatantly interfering. I get it. I would have probably done the same, but if we're looking at it from the perspective of his other officers, the other Night's Watch brothers, there's no argument that Jon hasn't broken his vows several times from the technical perspective. And Alice herself before the wedding, this is one of the reasons people like her so much. She is brave. She's confident. She almost reminds me of the Red Viper before dueling the Mountain. Remember? He's like eager. He's like, I can't wait to fight that guy. And Tyrion's like, really? You can't wait? You're eager to fight that guy? Like, wow. Now, this isn't a fight, even as many times as weddings and marriages have been described that way. No, she's ready. There's this great line from Jon. You're not scared?
Say it again.
You're not scared?
The girl smiled in a way that reminded Jon so much of his little sister that it almost broke his heart. Let him be scared of me.
Yeah, that does sound like something Arya would say, doesn't it? That's so cool.
Sounds like something Lyanna would say too.
Yeah, very true. And those vibes are there. In fact, we're about to talk about that. But first, yeah, she's marrying someone from a completely alien culture. She's joking about it as she does it. She's not just putting on a brave face. She seems legitimately unafraid. This guy is, like we said, a god king amongst his men and has 200 warriors, and she's about to just be amongst them. And she's facing all these different challenges and new scenarios, and she's just like, nah, I got this. This is no problem. And Jon also, he's thinking a little bit like a politician. He's like, hey, can we count on you in the future? Send us some young boys to join the watch, when the time is right. And she's like, you got it, Jon Snow. Carhold remembers. So she seems like a decent person. So it's also like making a deal with her, counting on her as a supporter of the Night's Watch in the future. As far as the health of the Night's Watch, wouldn't you depend on that more than Cregan Karstark, given what we've seen from him, or Arnulf? Yeah, I think so. Not to say that everything's going to go smoothly for sure, right? We do not know how it's going to go. Let's not get our hopes up too much. Sigorn could turn out to be a brutal husband, or bad luck could befall them and retaking Carholds, and things could go wrong. Winter could just... there's a lot of ways that could go wrong, right? So we might look back on this chapter as not so happy after all, once we know the fates of all these characters. Not knowing leaves room for optimism. Even if it does turn out badly, though, this is still a light in the dark. It's still a reprieve for the characters. They still feel that. That's still real. The hope is there, even if the hope doesn't pan out. It's still a portrayal of people making productive choices when the options are limited. It's still showing that strength amidst so much danger. It's a good wedding, right? People enjoy themselves. Bride and groom seem to like each other. So I don't actually think Sigorn is a brute. I'm just saying we don't know him that well. The wedding makes him look pretty good, but power can mess with people. So, we'll see. One line that troubles me a little bit is when he swears, it's written as, quote, the Magnar's promise was a white cloud in the air, which is, that's condensation from the heat in his breath, but it was written that way on purpose. Like, everyone's breath is doing that. It's winter. They're all like that. So I wonder if that's saying his promise is as strong as vapor, which I hope not. Wind and clouds aren't exactly signs of permanence. This line also could be foreshadowing, quote.
Oh, God. There's a cat knocking a book over. The snowflakes were melting on her cheeks, but her hair was wrapped in a swirl of lace that Satin had found somewhere, and the snow had begun to collect there, giving her a frosty crown. Her cheeks were flushed and red, and her eyes sparkled. Winter's lady. Jon squeezed her hand.
Does she realize what a cultural milestone she's part of here? Does he? It's such a big deal. This marriage is they may look down at it years later and say what an incredible accomplishment it was. And yeah, more Alice Lyanna paralleling. Winter's queen there, or Winter's lady. There's some Lyanna vibes there for sure. And these promises and all that, yeah. But more specifically, to allow Alice to escape her unwanted marriage, Rhaegar's son has arranged her wedding to a warrior prince when her kinsman Cregan comes looking for her and confronts Jon, demanding her back from Rhaegar's son. He's imprisoned on Jon's orders, along with his accompanying riders. Just as Aerys II had done with Brandon Stark and his companions after Brandon came to King's Landing to confront Rhaegar. It's even more neat than that. After one of Cregan's men is killed, Jon thinks that left 4, and Cregan himself and Brandon had also had 4 men with him going to King's Landing. Ethan Glover, Kyle Royce, Albert Aaron, and Jeffrey Mallister. 3 of those were killed, actually. Ethan Glover was not. Jon even considers killing Cregan as much as Aerys did Brandon, though he decides against it, given, Knight's Lord Commander executing a Karstark is pretty rough, politically speaking, even if he arguably had deserved it or earned it. It helps the parallel between Alicent and Lyanna even more that they're both daughters of men named Rickard. Alice is daughter of Rickard Karstark. Lyanna is the daughter of Rickard Stark. They both had 3 brothers, and their fathers at one time, Rickard, they're Rickards, both tried to arrange marriages to them, to Lord Paramounts, to heirs to great houses, right? Rickard wanted Alice to marry Robb Stark originally before having to pivot, and of course Rickard wanted Lyanna to marry Robert Baratheon. So, look at it this way. One wanted their daughter to marry Robb, and the other wanted them to marry Robert. They have this neat part of the ceremony where they leap the fire ditch while holding hands, and it reminds me a little bit of Dany jumping the fire with her silver back in Game of Thrones, which is yet another reminder or vibe of past marriages that we've seen. And of course, the symbolism of them becoming one during that jump is not to be missed. Melisandre blesses the ceremony in the name of R'hllor. There's a real ice and fire vibe there because Sigorn himself is standing by the fire, decked out in bronze, very much a picture of an ancient northern warrior, dressed more like something out of the First Men era than something in the time of Andals are around. So is this a good sign? Is this a sign of balance? Does the fire and ice dichotomy mean that it's going to work out? Or is it the kind of thing where we've seen elsewhere that fire and ice wipe each other out? They don't work together. They're canceling factors. A couple other guests to take note of here. Some elder clan chiefs that were too old to go on Stannis' campaign. I mentioned them earlier, but it's notable that they're attending a wedding where there's free folk. Because a lot of these northern lords, older ones especially, have a very long-developed prejudice against them. So it's good that they've either aren't of that type or they've set it aside. Again, I mentioned the dancing here. It's so wow, there's people dancing. That is just so unusual. It's it's a sign of a light in the dark when people are dancing. On the dark side of things, though, there's more a prejudice towards Satin we see here. And Joe Buckley asks an important but ominous question. What's going to happen to Satin after Jon's stabbing? There's so many people that don't like him. Someone might take a stab at him too while the chaos is out there. I hope not. Jon again predicts Sir Patrick's coming desire for blood. Of course, he has no idea how stupid Sir Patrick is going to be in finally making a choice on who to attack. He's like, I could attack Satin, I could attack this guy, but no, I'm going to go after the giant. Whoops. So now also in terms of downsides, yeah, it's a huge violation of Jon's vows. As good as it is for so many reasons, there is this. It's just not what a Lord Commander is supposed to do. It's blatantly against the rules. As correct as it is ethically, it's letter of the law wrong. And a couple other things that we have to criticize, even though we like the wedding. Well, they're short on food. Can they really afford to have even small feasts like this? Yeah. Maybe I don't know how much food was actually eaten, but it's another thing that doesn't look great. On the other hand, they're getting rid of these thens. 200 thens are taken off, so that's a lot fewer mouths to feed. But you know how these guys are. They're going to look at the downside. They're going to stick to their prejudices and not be optimistic. So this is all fodder for conspiracy against Jon. They're going to point to him wasting food, him breaking his vows, him friendly with free folk, arranging marriages. Lord Commanders aren't supposed to do that, right? This is all, they have a lot of ammunition for their anger now. And take note, Bowen Marsh did not attend the wedding. He's one of the men that stayed away, and that's ominous. Melisandre reminds him, she's like, dude, keep your wolf close. That my sense of the danger to you is getting closer, and he's just not focused on it. He's like, yeah, I know they don't like me. I know I'm doing things that make them angry. But he's more concerned about Stannis' reaction to this. He's more concerned about what's going to happen with Alice. He's just not thinking about himself as much. And we should be worried about that. Is there a chance Alice's marriage will be overturned? It's a marriage in the light of R'hllor, which a lot of people can object to. It's a marriage overseen by a Lord Commander. A lot of people can object to that. Not to mention the political implications of the people like Cregan, Karstark, who might find a way to nullify the marriage if given a chance. Of course, he's against it. We have to wonder what's going to happen to him. He's thrown in an ice cell. Jon argues with him, tells him what's up. He doesn't back down. Okay, you're going to stay in this ice cell then, dude. But Jon's going to be stabbed, and Cregan's going to still be in the ice cell. So what's going to happen there is another thing to think about. Fallout from Jon stabbing is that Bowen Marsh and his buddies could just let Cregan out, and Cregan could take their side because, well, they're against Jon, and he's against Jon. So I'm not saying Bowen's going to ally with Cregan, because then he would be breaking the vows he's trying to uphold, although that could happen. He might find it necessary. So a lot more potential for different players to get involved in that chaos afterwards. Interpretation of laws, big thing here, right? The semantics of the different laws. Of course, like I said, Jon is clearly breaking the rules in some places, but he's also able to get around some of the other ones by meeting Karstark on the road, right? They go south so that when Karstark arrives, he can't ask for guest right. And that's kind of similar to what we just saw with Lord Manderley openly discussing guest gifts, and is like, hey, I gave them guest gifts before they left. Hey, you can't call me for it. So basically getting around the rules, but properly. Right? He really is getting around the rules here, but unfortunately not other ones. But there's some irony there. Nina points out, Jon's like, your father's a Castellan, Cregan. Lords can't make marriage pacts. What Cregan should have said was, yeah, Cregan should have coughed in his face. What Cregan should have said is, neither can Lord Commanders make marriage pacts, bro. You can't do that. Who do you think you are, king in the north? Maybe he will be soon, but he's not right now. Actually, maybe he can claim that. He's like, technically, I was already king in the north. I just didn't know it yet. But the will was already written. It's like, more semantics could come into this. Technicalities. Jon needs to get a law degree, I'm telling you. Jon, speaking of saucy comebacks or sneaky maneuvers using language, there's a couple of good quotes here. Here's a brief moment when Melisandre takes note of Patchface.
Melisandre's face darkened. That creature is dangerous. Many a time I have glimpsed him in my flames. Sometimes there are skulls about him, and his lips are red with blood. I wonder you haven't had the whole poor man burned.
Yeah, so Jon's like, yeah, if you're scared of Patchface, why haven't you burned him, Mel? But it's perhaps meant to distract us from what might be a pretty legitimate threat. From Mel's perspective, I mean, I don't think Patchface is going to run around killing people, but he might run and kill her, or try to, because she's going to be the one, most likely, that burns Shireen. I do believe Stannis will give his consent first, but she's, of course, going to be the one that, runs the ritual. And that's Patchface's best friend there. Patchface loves Shireen, as far as we can tell, so he might be pretty pissed about that. And as far as her seeing skulls around him, we just saw this in Melisandre's chapter. The skulls came up a bunch of times in her visions, and every time it seemed to be a symbol for the undead, which Patchface might be undead, right? He was at sea like Davos style for several days, but he came back with a brain that wasn't quite right, unlike Davos, who seemed to come back pretty normal. But Davos wasn't actually floating in the water for 3 days. He didn't wash up ashore with the, with a body that felt like a corpse, according to the people who touched him, which is the case for Patchface. So watch out, Melisandre. And of course, it's not like that won't be disturbing even without the fact that those are two her best friends or whatever. And Patchface gives this famous line, under the sea, the mermen feast on starfish soup. Start over. Under the sea, the mermen feast on starfish soup, and all the serving men are crabs. That's another one I threw out to all y'all. And another one I got a wide variety of interpretations on. I'm not even going to bother with my own because I don't have one that I really like. This is a tricky one. I think this is going to be one of those ones that maybe when it's all said and done, or maybe just after the Winds of Winter, we're going to be like, oh, it's this. It might be George has given us the riddle or the answer, but he hasn't given us the riddle yet. We don't know. We don't have all the information. I think that's I think that's where we're at with this. We don't know what this means yet. It hasn't become clear yet. So we still have to wait for more writing, more chapters before this comes out. Because again, this is when you guys gave me a wide variety of interpretations. A lot of them I think are solid, but the fact that there isn't wide agreement on it, there weren't like, oh, I like that take, I like that take. Just a bunch of different takes. So to me, that says the fandom isn't terribly united on this one, which also says to me we probably haven't figured it out yet, or if we have, I can't tell. I don't know how to tell. So let's put that one on the shelf. Back briefly to danger to Jon. We were talking about Patchface might be a danger to Melisandre. Melisandre, of course, saying keep your wolf close. Well, too bad he doesn't. How close is the danger, though? She's like, it's very close now. This is chapter 50, and it's going to happen in chapter 70. So 20 chapters from now, Jon gets stabbed. This is Jon 10, and it's going to happen in Jon 13. Great quote from our Facebook friend and real friend, John Hagee, who says, Jon throwing such shade, he could shadow bind it. Check out this quote.
Alice Karstark leaned close to Jon. Snow during a wedding means a cold marriage. My lady mother always said so. He glanced at Queen Selyse. There must have been a blizzard the day she and Stannis wed.
Jon's on fire with the jokes, this one. That's really good. So he does think of Selyse a little bit. Selyse isn't in this chapter too much, but he notices just how devout she seems and how devoted to Melisandre she is. Like, he thinks, man, if Melisandre was like, hey, walk into the flames, she'd do it. Which is, to me, that's foreshadowing the Shireen business. Because Selyse isn't going to be asked to go into the flames, but asking your daughter to go into the flames and your mother is worse for a lot of mothers. Like, no, I would rather go in the flames than see my daughter do that. Almost any mother would do that. But, so this is kind of that same symbolic acceptance of that dark future that's in store for them. And of course, the overwhelming symbolism behind Melisandre's visions continues as we saw it from her perspective. Now we see when she's talking to Jon that he's asking, did you see Stannis in your flames? Did you see Mance in your flames? Did you see this? And she's like, snow. Stannis? Snow. Mance? Snow. Joe argues that this is actually an accurate vision. Because, yeah, Mance is snowed in at Winterfell. Stannis is even more snowed in at the Crofters Village. It's like, actually, yeah, that's pretty accurate. That is what's going on. So, yes, there's this whole, she's seeing snow, capital S, Jon himself for Azor Ahai, but she's not accidentally seeing Jon when she looks for Mance, right? So that's more direct when she sees snow from him. And that's very telling. So it's like, well, is this a wrong vision or is it perfectly accurate? I kind of lean towards that because, yeah, they're snowed in and that's what she's seeing. And here's one that's just real funny. It's like, come on, Melisandre, you're so close. She says, Stannis is the Lord's chosen because he's born amidst smoke and salt, and Dragonstone is the place of smoke and salt. And Stannis, blah, blah, blah. And Jon's like, but Stannis wasn't born there. And she's like, oh, don't worry about that. Who was born on Dragonstone, that smoke and salt, during an actual storm? Who actually raised dragons from stone? No one. It's no one Daenerys. No Daenerys is possible. No, yeah. So the day Melisandre learns that Daenerys exists is gonna. I hope we have that from her POV, because it's gonna be like her eyes are gonna be like, whoop, what have I done? Jon also discusses the Thenns a little bit with Alice as an aside here. We should mention that, how they're different from the rest of the Free Folk. They're more like Northmen in a lot of ways. And to me, it's a bit of a nice little dichotomy. We've got the Thenns are sort of the Northerners of the Free Folk, where the Blackwoods last chapter were the Northerners of the South. So that's kind of neat little parallel. I should maybe do a little more digging to see what else the Thens and the Blackwoods might have in common. And that's pretty cool that these two things are back to back like that. Hardhome, we get a little note on Hardhome. The ships have sailed. Jon's a little worried about Sir Glendon being in charge at Eastwatch, because Glendon was a friend of Alistair Thorne and Janos Slynt. And while Cotter Pike is on those ships, with soon it's going to be dead things in the water situation, those ships might be screwed. So Cotter Pike might die out there, and then Glendon would be in charge. And, well, that's not good for Jon. So something to keep an eye on there. Might even be, maybe one theory is that Alistair Thorne shows back up over there instead of back at the wall with his other two rangers that he went with. Although it's really been a long time now that those other 6 rangers have been missing. So the chance of those 6 coming back are not great. Alistair Thorne may indeed be a white by now. The new house sigil. That's cool. That's not something we get very often. It's pretty neat to see a new house formed. House Then of Carhold, basically. It's a bronze disc on a field of white wool surrounded by flames made with wisps of crimson silk. It's a really good symbol because the Karstark sigil itself is a white sunburst on black. So these two sigils have a lot in common. They work together, and it's really does a good job of describing visually what's happening here as a cultural milestone, as a combining of different ideas of different cultures and all that. I like it a lot. Really good. There's another just excellent detail work here in this chapter that really fills out the whole vision of what's going on. Really helps you picture it. Like, I can really picture when I think of marriages in A Song of Ice and Fire, those sigils are so important because culturally speaking, North and South both make a big deal out of that. So like when I'm imagining like on the TV show, seeing these weddings, see those wedding cloaks, it's something that my mind really goes towards, and that really helps me visualize this. Because it's harder to imagine what these people look like, even with their descriptions. There's so much room for your own version of interpretation, but these sigils are a lot more clear. Like, the descriptions are so much more distinct. There's less interpretation possible here. So I appreciate some distinct visuals to lock onto. Another really random note here, good catch by Nina. The Flint great-grandmother that Jon references here, because he's talking about his own family. He's got a Flint in his own family history, is Arya Flint, which is probably who Arya is named for. And that Arya Flint was married to Roderick Stark, who was known as the Wandering Wolf, who was once a member of the Second Sons a long time back. And he's the mother of Lyanna, who was the wife of Rickard, the Rickard Stark. Yes, Rickard Stark married his own cousin, kind of like Tywin did. And from that union came Brandon, Ned, and Lyanna. Okay, a few thoughts from y'all. Dornish James says, in some ways, Mel wedding Alice to Sigorn using R'hllor traditions makes me think of Visenya wedding another Alice Haraway, to Maegor using Valyrian marriage rites. Thank you for saying that, Dornish James. You know what? I actually thought the same thing and forgot about it. So you picked up my mistake there. That's awesome. Yeah, the idea of fiery marriage rites, it also makes us think of potentially what happens with Rhaegar and Lyanna off page, because if they're using the Targaryen exceptionalism rule, then they may have not had the marriage under the light of the Seven. They may have, because why not? I mean, that would be, under Targaryen exceptionalism, that would still be allowed, but they may have used a different set of vows. So, but this is more certain. We know for sure Maegor used the Valyrian rites here, so this is perhaps a better comparison, because it's for now at least, we know it happened, where the other is just a guess. Off page, it's just Harrion Karstark is mentioned, and his fate is mentioned or alluded to. He's still alive, though. As far as we can tell, Alice and Sigorn will show up there and sort of have temporary control. Harrion may very well survive and come back to Carhold, and if so, it's his. He may yet die. He's still in captivity. It looks like he's at Maidenpool. He may have been transferred to King's Landing, because as Jaime told the Freys, remember, they're trying to collect a lot of those captives. Jaime ordered the Freys to give them the Greatjon. It's like, yo, you have him in captivity. We want him for ourselves. Whether that's actually going to happen or not, who knows? As far as we know, they have not yet acceded to that request or that demand. As far as we know, the Great John is still in captivity at the Twins, has not been sent to King's Landing yet. So we'll see about that. But this is a similar sort of idea where this character is kept in the South, kept hostage. If they ever get let free, it could change some things politically. But it might also be the case of they're still in prison when King's Landing gets blown up and they just die because of that. Could be that simple and that horrible. Tree Girl with a great catch here. The quote, "Rusted hinges screamed like damned souls when Wick Whittlestick yanked the door wide enough for Jon to slip through." That is him going into the ice cells to talk to Cregan. He sees his reflection in the ice cells, for one thing. That's a really ominous, because it's certainly one of the major theories around Jon's stabbing is that he's going to be put in an ice cell. His body's going to be stashed there, which would be why he can see his own reflection there, because he's about to be there. He's about to be among them. Wick Whittlestick opens the door for him. Wick Whittlestick's one of the conspirators who stabs him. Rusted hinges screaming like damned souls. Okay, first of all, it summons, brings Euron to mind, and poor Aeron Greyjoy's trauma from his childhood, as Euron would come to abuse him at night. Damned souls, that also sounds like second life almost, going into a white, or just being animated as a white, and the others are controlling you and ruling you, that's a pretty good way to portray a damned soul being ruled by a magical undead being. So that is a rich symbolic sentence. Thanks for catching that, Tree Girl. Keep an eye out for more things like that. Archmaester Rennie gives us a nice hint to another reference outside of this story to one of George's other works. There's a story called Bitter Blooms, where George originally introduced the concept of old men announcing that they're going on a hunt with the intention of going out to die in order to save their family the burden of feeding them. That concept exists in the story Bitter Blooms, which is Dream Songs 1 or 2, I forget. Also in Bitter Blooms is the Blue Roses. So that's a really good one. Also, that happens in the show Norseman.
Yeah, you can watch the pilot, the first episode, and I think you'll appreciate what they do with it.
Norseman is a full-blown comedy, by the way, if you didn't know. It is hilarious. There's
it's on
18
Netflix
episodes.
in the U.S.
Yeah. And especially if you like the show Vikings, is like a comedy. It's like they make fun of a lot of the things that happens in Viking. They make fun of battle scenes and like, how do you know what side you're on? Things like that. Like,
how do you know?
Yeah, like how did they know?
Yeah, one of the guys like, I just kill everyone that's around me.
It's like, if they're facing this way, I kill. It's really funny. So I highly recommend Norseman. If you guys do watch it, please come to one of our social media platforms and tell us what you think of it. It's one of the many things you can discuss. It's not just about A Song of Ice and Fire. We try to have fun with a variety of topics. This chapter ends with Tormund's arrival. He's a big part of the rest of Jon's chapters, of which there are 3. We finished this batch of chapters with Jon, and we will next week as well. So Jon's, him and Dany are really huge the rest of the way. Although, of course, Dany actually is going to take a break because she's going to fly off on Drogon next week, and then we won't see her for a while. Her place will be taken by Barristan. So Jon is going to be particularly dominant, but that makes sense because he's got the most screen time in the book. Last week we covered 2 weeks ago we covered 172 minutes 52 seconds. This week it's almost the same, 169.07, about 3-4 minutes shorter. We have crossed the 2,000 minute mark in A Dance with Dragons, just past it, like 2,006 minutes basically. Still more than 900 minutes to go in the book. We're just past the 2/3 mark. 2/3 would be 66.6. We're at 68.6. So there you go. As usual, you can check the podcast version compared to the video version to get an idea of how much each episode gets edited. You may prefer the more laid back, jokey version of the video. You might like the tighter, edited, fewer ums and uhs and pauses and coughs version of the podcast. Either way, please leave us a review, give us an upvote, a like, a subscribe, all those different things. You might be surprised how much that helps us get picked up by the algorithms. And if you like it, if you like what you're seeing enough, if you spend a lot of time with us, maybe it's time to sign up for Patreon. You could do that by going to patreon.com/historyofwesteros and find the level that's right for you. We got lots of bonus episodes if you go, plus access to our scripts, other things like that. One thing you get as well is scripted episodes early, which as of this recording, it is, what's the day? It's the 10th of January. Pretty soon, we're going to have an early episode release, scripted episode with the Giants. So not a bad time to get involved. Either way, we appreciate the support in any form it comes. Thank you for coming live if you did so. And we hope to see you in our different groups or on Twitter or wherever you can interact with us. We mentioned a few different scripted episodes this time, a couple of which have been coming up semi-regularly, like Battle of Ice and Battle of Fire. Those have been foreshadowed almost every chapter in the North and in Essos recently. Our Weirwood tour episodes seem to be coming up a lot. There's lots of Weirwood action, lots of patterns to understand and dive into and have fun with. Bloodraven comes up constantly, of course, so we'll shout him out again. And we've got 3 full episodes on him. Aegon the Unworthy is our first Blackfire episode, so if you haven't gotten into our Blackfire series, it's a good time to start. We rearranged our podcast feed, so that's the first episode you see. And of course, at the beginning, we mentioned our Blackwood episodes, 1 and 2. Those are co-written by Joe Buckley as well. Next time, 4 more chapters. The only time in all of Valar Rereadis A Dance with Dragons that we're going to have 2 chapters from the same character in the same week is going to be next week. We're going to have Daenerys 8, A Dornish Frog in the Dragon Pit, a.k.a. A Feast for Foes.
Theon 1, Jane, it rhymes with airplane, a.k.a. Big Walder won't grow up to be a Frey.
And Daenerys 9, the one in Dazdak's Pit, a.k.a. Daenerys 9, the one in Daznak's Pit, a.k.a. How to Train Your Drogon.
And Jon 11, Packed in Black, a.k.a. the one where Shireen is unclean.
Yes. So that'll be fun. Good chapters. A couple people taking off. Dany on a dragon, Theon and Jane straight down into a snowdrift.
A couple of those titles you need to sing for us.
Packed in Black.
Yeah.
Big Wilder, don't let your baby grow up to be Freys.
Oh, perfect.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thanks to Joe and Nina for their invaluable assistance. Thank you to our mods over on the History of Westeros Facebook group and in our Discord server. Much love for y'all. Thanks to you all who participate over on Flick as well and Slack. Thanks to Michael Klarfeld for the video intro and the maps you see behind. Thank you to Kevin MacLeod for the Valar Rereadis music. Thanks to Joey Townsend and Jesse Koval for the History of Westeros regular theme music. Thanks to our Bengineer for the excellent sound work and assistance. Thank you to our patrons for making all of this financially viable. And it looks like Here Be Dragon is covering The Expanse episodes 4 to 6 tonight. And Ashea on Fandom Media will be covering episode 6 of The Expanse, probably Monday night. Looks like around 7 Eastern. Keep an eye on Fandom Media for when those Expanse episodes are popping. Ashea and Kyle are doing that, but the start times have moved around a little bit.
Yeah, we move it around because we just want to talk and have fun.
So check it out afterwards if you can't catch it live. Either way. And we will see you next week for more Valar Rereadis.